Haman, who is the Special Advisor to the Secretary General of the UN on Africa, and has just come down from New York to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
And we have Florie Lizer, who is the CEO and President of the Corporate Council on Africa and the former U.S. Trade Rep on Africa. And Ambassador Arikana Chiambori-Quo, who is the African Union Ambassador to the U.S. And Brahima, who we all know. And Tion Yang, who is the co-founder of Acon Lighting Africa, and is the founder of the, the Give One project. I know you so much from Acon Lighting, but we have to mention the other. The Give One project. So thank you so much for all being here. And I think that it's really interesting. We have sort of all the different elements, the international element, the African Union, the African institution element, the private sector, and also individual initiatives that are happening. So it should be really interesting hearing from all sides. So we're going to start with each person giving some remarks. We'll have about 5 minutes for each person giving remarks. After that, we will have a discussion up here. And last, we want to hear from everybody on your questions out here, and also for the people who are listening. And I think for everybody, I would encourage everyone to weigh in on Twitter. It's #ForesightAfrica. And join the conversation. If you are in the room, please do. And if you're outside, we're very happy to have you, and we hope that you will join us on Twitter. So with that, Ambassador Chiambori-Quo, if we can start with you, since this is all about African institutions coming in and leading the charge, let's start with the AU and hear the AU perspective.
You had to put me on the hot seat. That's okay. Africa is a big continent. We have to take the hot seat. Well, as you all might know erroneously, we are not the dark continent that we have been painted to be. If the truth be told, the sun shines brightest on Africa. And so to call us a dark continent is a serious misnomer. Let's also look at why the continent is painted in the manner that it is painted. It takes us back to our colonial masters, who set out a strategy that, starting with the Africans themselves, not respecting and believing in themselves and that which is uniquely theirs. A program that was sealed and implemented during the Berlin Conference of 1885. And that is when they divided our continent and chopped it up like a piece of pie into some of the smallest economies, clearly designed to make sure that the continent cannot survive on its own. Small countries like my sister here from Rwanda, we have Togo, we have Burundi, and all by design. A system that then proceeded to teach and let the Africans think that everything that is African and uniquely ours was bad, and that everything that's Western, and particularly British at that time, and French, was better. They proceeded to implement that program of divide and conquer. And sadly, I wish I could tell you that centuries later, the African has woken up and realized what has been done to the African. creation of OAU in 1963 was an attempt by our Pan-African leaders to regroup and undo the damage that was done to the African. Because Kwame Nkrumah and others realized that for Africa to take its rightful place on the world stage, the gutter of the mind that we have lived in for centuries must be cleaned up. No amount of education, no Harvard degree can save Africa unless the legacy of colonialism, and for those African children who were brought outside Africa in shackles, the legacy of slavery. We must recover from all that. I have sat in many meetings and I have listened to scholars and those who claim to understand Africa. Quite often, sometimes they are not even African. Some have been to Africa a couple of times and suddenly they are gurus on Africa. And everybody is talking about the monkeys and the squirrels in the room. But no one wants to touch the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room. And that is our thinking as the African people. How much do we understand our Africa? Why is it that the richest continent on earth, the go-to place for the world, is painted as the poorest? And I am not going to mince my words. The truth of the matter is the world needs Africa. Africa does not need the world. We have everything we need on earth. We could paralyze the world economies. Take a simple thing. Like we decide DRC can no longer export its coltan. That alone can paralyze the world. So rather than us Africans concentrating on the issues that matter, concentrating on issues that we need to take home, like telling France that 500 billion you're taking out of Africa every year, no more. France needs to be the third world developing country, not Africa. We got some serious issues to deal with, but I call that housekeeping. Because these are issues that need to be addressed by us, the Africans. And in order for us to begin to deal with all those issues, it starts with an African who understands, who gets it. Because the Africans must take what is rightfully theirs, but it starts with us getting our act together. So I appreciate the platform, and I hope to hear more about how we can all come together, but more importantly, the Africans, we must wake up, because we too must take our Africa back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So, David, if you can give us the UN perspective.
Thank you, Madam, and thank you all for being here. Good morning, everybody. I would like to take the opportunity to congratulate the Africa Group initiatives and my dear friend Brahima for on this 10th anniversary. The good quality of the report that we have before us is really illustrates the good work and the excellence of and the commitment to do so for the next years and for strategic analytical thinking for the next 10 years or more. The theme of today's session provides a big opportunity to cover a wide variety of issues. Starting by considering the Africa's regional agenda as well as the global agenda, there is much to talk about. Actually, there is a lot to talk about. Just to give you an example, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has 17 goals and about 169 targets. The 2030 Agenda, the African Union Transformative Agenda 2063 is much broader has about 20 goals and 256 targets. So you can just imagine the priority that we have for these two agendas. Both of them are extensive and literally covers all the sectors that we are talking about. So the question today is which issues Africa should be focusing, which priority of the priority for 2018. So the path, according to my own opinion, is to really focus on the priorities on the sector that would have a multiplier effect. The sectors and the area that for $1 spent would generate many dollars in different sectors. The report has many areas that we can focus on, but I will just focus on three, given the time constraint that I have, which namely regional integration, infrastructure development, manufacturing-led economic transformation, and finally youth empowerment and youth unemployment. And all of these have multiplier effect, as I mentioned, on trade, on employment, on job creation, on income, and would be vital for African priorities. Let me talk about regional integration. The free movement of goods and services and people is vital for African development. But unfortunately, the numbers are not there. The intra-African trade today stands at about 12% of the continental trade, total trade. In comparison, the intra-regional trade in North America and Europe is about 60%. It's about 40% in Asia and about 20% in Latin America. Regrettably, based on these figures, we can see that Africa doesn't trade with Africa. Africa rather trade with the rest of the world, one ocean away, one border, one country away, but definitely not with Africa. I'll give you an example. If a South African supermarket chain wants to import products from Zambia, wants to export and sells products to its stores in Zambia, the import permits alone cost about $20,000 a week. To send one truck across the border, the same chain, supermarket chain, has to provide 1,600 documents. So just gives you how far difficult it is and what are the challenges that facing Africa. Same thing for intra-regional. In addition to that, the intra-African travel is very difficult and constrains business travel. It constrains also tourism in Africa. And here, the challenges are big. Every barrier to trade, every barrier to travel costs billions of dollars to Africa every year. And this is subsidizing actually the rest of the world. And the Continental Free Trade Area is vital for Africa for these purposes and has a trickle-down effect and has a trickle effect on the rest of the continent. Let me move, because of the time constraint, let me move on the manufacturing, which is the second area that I would want to focus. The numbers are there. The total manufacturing GDP, total GDP, the share of the manufacturing of total GDP is about 10% over the last decade. It represents 1.5% of the total output production manufacturing. Compared to Asian countries, it's 20%. So it shows you the difficulties of getting that. But the problem here is that African growth has largely been driven by capital-intensive extractive industry with little value addition, and that the growth has not been accompanied and not been driving job creation in the continent. As a result, the continent has a growth that is not inclusive, and wealth and economic opportunities are just left between few hands. Therefore, strengthening, promoting labor-intensive manufacturing with value addition would have a multiplier effect, allowing more inclusive growth and shared prosperity. Every job in manufacturing is estimated to create at least 2 more jobs in the other sector. The last part, if you allow me, is youth. The numbers are staggering. 75% of the population is under 30. Africa has the fastest growing labor force in the world. Youth represent 37% of the labor force and make up 60% of unemployment. So these are the numbers, and about 12 to 15 million new entry to the labor market every year. So we shouldn't consider youth as a problem to be resolved, but as a resources to be harnessed. Then the estimates are being made that if we create this 12 to 15 million jobs, the growth, GDP growth in Africa will double. And that failure to address the youth employment, and I will stop there, is not only an economic concern, but has peace and security implications. We'll take Boko Haram, we'll take Al-Shabaab. It's because unemployment is so high that we have people that are accepting $40 a day to detonate a bomb either in Somalia or in Nigeria or in Mali, etc. So the three priorities that would have trickle-down effects on the rest economy are the priorities that I consider are good for Africa. Thank you very much, Madam.
Very good. Thank you so much. It's hard to fit in all the priorities that need to be put out there. So, Flory,
Yes.
if we can hear from you with the private sector perspective.
Right. So first of all, let me congratulate the Africa Growth Initiative and the fact that there are thought leaders here at Brookings who, thanks to those like Dr. Konjo-Iweala who helped establish it, are making sure that there is a spotlight and focus on Africa, which is warranted. I think all of us here know that. So, when we talk about, for the private sector, looking at the priorities for 2018, CCA, which is a leading business association focused solely on Africa and promoting business in Africa, between the U.S. and Africa. And we have about 140 member companies, large and small, African and U.S., U.S. and African. And so I'm delighted to be here to talk a bit about that. 2017 was a tough year for business and doing business in Africa, especially from the U.S. side. There were uncertainties about the new U.S. administration and whether and how it would focus on Africa. There were continuing issues with commodity prices and the fact that so much of Africa's GDP is still dependent on primary commodities with truly not enough value addition. And my history, as you know, working on promoting trade in Africa and its ability to produce non-oil exports, there were those issues. There was political uncertainty also on the continent. There were elections in various key countries, Liberia, Kenya, Angola, etc. So there were those uncertainties. But I think 2017, there were also some positive things that were happening on the continent. There were announced some very major investments in African infrastructure, in rail and road, some of which U.S. companies like Bechtel are involved in. There was a report from the World Bank of increased doing business improvement across the continent. The Africans had some of the best reforms in terms of the doing business environment. And again, there was also some reporting of improvements. It's from a very small base, but improvements in African non-oil and services exports. But for 2018, I'd like to just highlight three things that we think at CCA, its members who are collectively invested in Africa's most promising sectors, including agribusiness, energy, finance, health, infrastructure, tourism, and trade. Three areas. One is improved environment for investment in trade and business on the continent. On the U.S. side, we would like to see U.S. institutions like OPIC, Exim Bank, TDA, USAID, and others fully funded and functioning so that U.S. businesses can compete more effectively with the many other companies from around the world that see Africa as an important and strategic growth market. On the African side, further reductions in red tape, effective one-stop shops for investors, implementation of laws and regulations that facilitate business, that's important. The second area and priority would be expanded markets and business opportunities driven by African regional integration and the removal of barriers to intra-African trade, which has already been mentioned. Small African economies and markets merging together into larger regional markets that offer economies of scale will certainly spur more investment, not just from the U.S., but from everybody, including Africans, by the way, and it will make it possible for Africans to participate in regional and global value chains. And the third area is to make progress on significant business transactions and deals. Frankly, beyond supporting a supporting environment and framework for greater U.S.-Africa trade and investment, there has to be real progress in closing deals and completing transactions. So that's the transactional focus. We have the framework, but we also have to make progress on specific transactions. And often this takes too long and often requires the involvement of African heads of state. This is why, from CCA's perspective, we're working with UNECA, having an event in about 2 weeks on the sidelines of the AU Summit, where we are focused on how to promote specific improvements in African business and investment in some key areas. And we invite you to come and be a part of that if you're there for the AU Summit. And again, we just think that progress has to be made and that these priorities are really critical for business, and again, not just U.S. businesses, but African businesses to thrive in 2018. Those are the priorities we see. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Zetian, we have heard about the importance of the multiplier effect. Nothing is more of a multiplier effect than getting power generation out there. Please talk to us about Aecon Lighting and your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brookings and Doctor, for the invitation. I bring you the greetings from the people of Senegal. I just landed this morning from my home country. And just from the airport, I just came straight up here. So I might look pretty rough and sleepy. I basically changed my suit from the car outside because the traffic, I couldn't make it back to the house. But yeah, thank you for having me again. This topic is very dear to me because as she talked about in her introduction, the ambassador, they call us the dark continent. And we are the dark continent, unfortunately. 600 million Africans live in the dark today. Half of the continent is the biggest in the world. If we don't do anything, nothing will happen. And without energy, you can't do anything. Right now, I'm talking to you, but as soon as the electricity was cut off in a minute, or you go home and there is no electricity or warm water, you'll be fussing and calling on somebody. Because that's something that you're used to. That's something that became so accustomed to your daily lives. But my friends, I'm here to tell you that in my home continent, in Africa, 600 million of those people never know what lights is about. They never seen electricity before. I grew up into those conditions. In my grandfather's house, I had to wake up early in the morning at 6, 7 a.m. so I can catch the sun again to finish what I didn't finish on studying the night before. That's why the work we're doing is very personal to us. You know, all across the world, there is always a generation that came and dreamed and pushed the limits in this great country that we are today in the United States. There was a young president named Kennedy who dreamed of the impossible, to go to the moon, and drove his country to push the limits. A young man like Dr. King did it here, to allow people like President Obama and myself to do the things we did not imagine in the 60s to happen in this country. A young man in Singapore did it, Lee Kuan Yew. When Malaysia left, a country with no natural resources, today is a model of nation building. So I'm here to tell you that my generation, the generation of Akon, the generation of Samba Bachili, the generation of Dangote Chonyang, and his generation, we know nothing about slavery. We know nothing about independence, even though we acknowledge the work that our founding fathers has done. I know, and I know that. When Nkrumah was dreaming about the unification of Africa, when Patrice Lumumba was talking about a change and control of our economic models in the continent, when Sékou Touré and Senghor finished school in Europe and go back to liberate our countries in Africa, such as Senegal, my home country, I knew they will not finish the work. And I knew they knew the sacrifices they were making were not for them. It was for another generation to come. It was for their children and their grandchildren. Their grandchildren is here. I'm here. We're here. And I'm here to tell you that this generation will transform the continent. We know the challenges. We've traveled the world. We've seen it. We've traveled the world. We understood the world. We've traveled the world. We know how nations are built. And we are looking for partners like you who will come to our continent in a win-win situation. But a new leadership, a new wave of change is flooding on the skies of the continent. And it will become the best of the best, and nothing but the best. This is why Akon and I are sacrificing to make sure we bring energy in the continent. This is why in my Jeff Zone project, yesterday at this time, I was in my farms with young people helping me to play our part in making sure that we feed our people. We have 35% of edible land in the continent, yet we spend $35 billion importing food in our continent. I want to do something about that. And my generation will change that. So it is to tell you that we are concerned, but we're optimistic because the challenge is high, but we really take on the challenges. And as our founding fathers, we know if we don't finish to see what we're working for. The young people that I am training through Give One Project, the young people that Tony Elemelu is training through the Tony Elemelu Foundation, the young people we're training through the Solar Academy, Akon and I Solar Academy, and etc., and etc., and etc. I am pretty sure they will take on the fight and they will change the continent. But for now, where we are doing what we can and what we can't, and to invite the diaspora to know that Africa will not change without them. Their expertise is needed in the continent. Until we come to do our part, it will not be the Africa we dream about. And I know you're telling me the time is up, but I wish you gave me 30 more minutes. Thank you so much for the introduction.
Well, thank you, everyone. And, you know, it's so interesting listening. And I'm thinking as I'm listening to you and all of you and the passion that you bring to this, how important it is, you know, historically, if we look back 20 years ago, there weren't as many Africans that were brought into the space on development. Africans wanted to, but they were kept out. And having Africans in means it's personal. Now the development, it matters on a personal level, and the passion is there. You know, Ambassador, one of the things that really struck me in President Kagame's article that he wrote for the report was he talked about the importance of speaking with one voice, of Africa coming together, that after colonialism, Africa was very separated, and that made it more difficult to develop. But that now with the African Union and with other vehicles, Africa is really coming together. And you see this throughout Africa, all the regional institutions that are happening. One thing I thought was very interesting, I think the AU is really stepping into its, that space of being the spokesperson, if you will, the spokes institution for Africa. We saw that last week with the events that happened in the U.S. And I would love to hear your thoughts about speaking with one voice, of Africa speaking with one voice and unleashing the power of 1.2 billion people into that voice.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say, I just feel so proud. Right now, I'm flying a few feet above the ground. This is what we are looking for. Yeah. So when I said Africa does not need the world needs its Africa, you hit the nail in the head, my son. We have so much expertise in the diaspora. And all we're doing is saying, the children of Africa, come back home. But my sisters like Flori here, whose grandparents were brought in chains and were promised 10 acres and a mule. I often say, your 40 acres and your mule are in Africa waiting for you. Just come on home. You know, because we have everything we need. When you take our resources on the continent and our people around the globe, that's all we need to complete the puzzle. So I just feel so wonderful sitting next to you. Going back to the African Union, I was started by saying 1963, our Pan-African leaders came together to regroup and recreate and take back what was taken away from us. Today, fast forward, 54 years later, we're still work in progress. But be it as it may, it has taken us a long way to get to where we are today. Everybody understands. My brother here mentioned it. Why is it that we don't trade with each other? Something that simple. We are unable to accomplish it because when you go to that boardroom table with a colonized mind, your thinking is colonized, the outcome is colonized. It is sickening. Even as I sit here, speaking as an ambassador, but also speaking as an African, to see the obvious situations, a brick that needs to be moved from point A to point B. Well, guess what? It's got to go all the way to Z and then back before it gets to B. And you want to say, duh, what is wrong with this picture? It goes back to the mind. The African mind must change. We need more people like this young man here, because what is happening in Africa today is unacceptable. We can't take care of ourselves. We have the largest arable land on the continent, and yet in some countries we are importing food. Yep. I sit in some meetings, I will be very honest with you, I am embarrassed. When you look at the things that we are doing as Africans, it's unacceptable. So yes, at the African Union level, we are talking about regional and continental integration. The buzz is there. We all know what needs to be done in order for Africa to move forward. I know there are others who talk about corruption. Oh yes, we know. We got corruption within the country. But while we are working on corruption within our continent, we must also ask for that corruption that has always been there, that is coming from outside. Because that's another corruption that nobody is talking about. They all make it look like, oh, corruption in Africa. Yes, we have corruption, but there's even more corruption coming from outside. I mean, some of you, if you ever have the opportunity to fly low above DRC or some of the Central African countries, you'll find tarmacs in the middle of the jungles. Those are the things I'm talking about, nobody ever talks about. Flight 737s are flying right into the jungles of DRC, picking up the minerals and flying right out. In the areas of the Kasai, nobody can get to. Who is talking about those thieves? Nobody. There is so much more of that corruption. I was a tourist in Kimberley, South Africa, and flights were flying in and flying out, and I thought I was at the international airport. I asked our tour guide, I said, I didn't realize Kimberley, South Africa has an international airport. She said, oh, no. These are planes coming out from outside to pick up the minerals. I'm like, what? Where are they going with the minerals? It's our London Stock Exchange. I'm like, wow. So how does South Africa, how that does this, or what is it? Oh, no, they get royalties. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the monster in the room. So while we try to work on regional and continental integration, those outsiders with ulterior motives are coming in quietly, creating conflicts. If you look like these Africans are beginning to get it together, next thing you know, there's an uprising. There's conflict here. We too, the Africans, must now wake up and smell the coffee and see what is being done to us and stop it in its tracks. And that's what we are doing from the African Union now.
Bravo.
That's wonderful. You know, you remind me, Ngozi had once said to me, and I thought it was, it really changed my thinking. We talk a lot about corruption in Africa, but Ngozi, you had said to me, there is the taker, but there's also the giver. And we have to think about both sides in corruption, and you're really spot on with talking about the planes coming in and out. There's another side of corruption, and we have to look at that side. Brahma, I would love to hear from you, talking also about intra-African trade. I thought it was fascinating in the report, the focus you put on the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And one statistic, if I may, that I thought was amazing was we're always talking about added value and the importance of manufacturing, how that will create jobs. It's crucial for the youth bulge and economies in Africa. And that intra-African trade is 41% of manufacturing goods. Exports are just 14%. So if Africa wants to look at manufacturing and growing its manufacturing base, it's clearly intra-African trade that's going to get it there. So I wanted to hear from you about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the importance. It sounds like very dry words. Oh, that's just an agreement. That can't be that interesting. But when you really delve into it, it's fascinating.
Yes, it is. So, before I get to the continental trade, let me say, as we were putting together the panel in AGI, the discussion came up, and we're like, we need to really have a young person at least on the panel. Because we talk about youth inclusion, we talk about women inclusion. That inclusion has to also start with us. And I'm really pleased that we have a balanced panel in terms of gender, and we have a young and very capable young person also on the panel. In fact, when I talk about Africa, and what gives me hope is really the energy and vibrance of the young people. I was at a conference, the G20 or T20 in Berlin, and it happened to be around the time also where they had a Y20. Apparently, that's the version of the G20, but for young people. And I ended up spending more time exchanging with the young people from Africa, and I actually enjoyed that perhaps a bit more admittedly than I did the conference itself, for which I was in Berlin. And just to give you a couple of examples, a young lady, she must be in her early 20s, from East Africa, has given up everything else, set up a website, went around rural areas in the country to just collect the voices of women and bring that into the political and social discourse. And another young guy who was actually handicapped, but from Cote d'Ivoire. And he set up an NGO that is expanding across West Africa just to educate their fellow young people about the dangers of migration and bringing in some who have tried and failed and now have horror stories to tell to come and speak to the young people who are thinking about taking on that dangerous journey. So when we talk about the future of Africa, it's really about the young people. And one development agency came to me to discuss ideas so they can update their own strategy as when it pertains to the continent. I told them there's one thing you're going to do, just find a way to enable access to, say, cell phone and internet connection for as many young people as you can. And then it's going to be the role of the government to actually enable them. But if they can't, that's just to stay out of their way. The young people have so much courage and so much energy that they can bring about changes that are quite amazing. On the continental free trade, my surprise is, why has it taken us so long? But the progress on it has been quite encouraging, and the African institutions there are really pushing it. So the expectation is that coming up in 3 months or so, they're going to sign that continental trade agreement. And estimates kind of vary, but they suggest that it's susceptible to boosting really the country's trade, almost double the country's trade if they knock down all the barriers to trade. I think it was long overdue, and it's something that's going to contribute greatly to the prosperity of the continent.
You know, can I have you just talk a little bit about what that will mean? What will it look like on the ground when that agreement has come through?
What agreement that has come through, and let's say it's implemented in all of its forms, because often what we do see is a little bit of a gap between the policies design itself and its implementation. But if it's really implemented the right way, what we're going to see is much more easy movements between countries without some kind of tariffs, whether they are explicit or implicit, infringing on that movement of goods and services. And that's going to allow neighboring countries to be able to share more of their expertise in terms of production. And then it's actually through that trade, you're going to begin to see more labor movement as well, because those are also some of the secondary beneficiaries of high trading. And then you're going to begin to see more integration de facto along other dimensions that are not even just trades of goods and services.
Let me just make a comment on that as well. Just to emphasize the point, the Continental Free Trade Area, by all analysis, business communities should be excited about it. Outsiders coming to do business in Africa, just like you listed the issues to do business in Africa. But guess what? They are already countries, our trading partners, that have already voiced their concern about the Continental Free Trade Area. Figure that out. That's my only comment.
Yes, thank you, Madam. I just want to build on the comments on the Continental Free Trade Agreement areas. To mention that some regional economic communities has actually already their own agreements within the area, and actually trade has already been increasing for EAC, for example, ECOWAS, etc. So it's already taking place at the sub-regional level, and now it's just a matter of putting all at the harmonizing the standards, harmonizing the laws, harmonizing the regulation, harmonizing the institution. Takes some time. So it is in the making, but regionally and sub-regionally, it is on the right path. And putting together about 1.2 billion market, it's a large market with economy of scales would be important, and having a possibility to cross the borders without any problem that I mentioned earlier is a big GDP, about GDP, combined GDP about $3.4 trillion, which is compared to the big countries in the world. But that said, I just want to mention that Africa, even though Africa might not trade with Africa, as I mentioned earlier, Africa has put together and is putting its act together. I'll give you one example. I mentioned earlier in my introduction the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And at the same time, I mentioned the 2030 Agenda, for the 2063 Agenda. Both of them are more or less coherent and harmonized, and there is a good, actually, synergy between them. It's not that the SDGs, it's not that the 2030-63 is reflected in the SDGs, but the other way around. And why is that? It's because African countries has actually developed and put together a common African position to negotiate the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As a matter of fact, all the goals, all the targets that are in the 2030 Agenda are already reflected in the 2063 Agenda. So African has a common position, not only for this particular negotiation, but also on climate change, on financing for development. So the African has already understood that it starts sometime by having this regional or international agreement that we can have a common position. And it's the only region in the world, and let me mention it, it's the only region in the world that has a common position on a variety of issues. Now, talking about corruption, and I agree with you, Madam and Brahima, corruption. Africa is sitting on $50 billion of illicit financial flows. That is coming mainly, 70% of it comes from tax evasion, tax avoidance of multinational corporations that are producing in Africa. Just capturing that $50 billion a year is already the equivalent of the official development assistance in Africa. So just to give you a rough example. Another issue is the fact that the value addition, if we look at cocoa, where Africans produce about 60% of the world production, for every chocolate that is sold in the world, the farmers in Africa capture only 7% of the final price of it, 7%, while they are the ones who are producing most of the cocoa. The Nestle has sales, total sales, bigger than African countries. And that's you have, so these are how it has to be negotiated. So all of it, if we take into consideration the products, the extractive industry, and capture the value addition, the global value addition, and capture the illicit financial flows. In addition to that, Africa is sitting on about $300 billion of pension funds. If these funds are invested in Africa and repatriated in Africa, where, by the way, the rate of return is double. The rate of return of investment in Africa is the double of the rate of return internationally. If all of this comes together, the illicit financial flows, if we go to the global value chain, if we have all these resources of pension funds, in addition to that, the sovereign funds, which are about 160 billion, are invested in Africa, there'll be no youth unemployment, there'll be no problem of youth insecurity, there'll be no problem of industrialization, and Africa would trade with Africa. Thank you very much, madam.
I want to add on to that.
That is incredibly inspiring. It is amazing. We hear about, sort of money under the mattress. Africa has enough for its own development, and we just have to, again, unleash it and have it come out.
But also trade with Africa fairly.
Yes.
You see,
Can I
that
jump into
platform
that?
of equality
Please.
is what's
Okay.
missing. Because we are treated as underdogs and we are there to be exploited. We must be treated fairly. And that's where we should begin.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our friend from the United Nations, the SDGs are good. Those are very good plans, I think, for the world. But there is some fundamental things that Africa don't have today that, unfortunately, we're racing to catch up with you. Leapfrogging is good, but there's some steps you cannot leapfrog. You have to go through them. For example, we didn't have home telephones in many of the African homes because we went straight up to cell phones. Today, the United States, Asia, and recently the United Emirates were able to build their fundamental infrastructures. And before all of that, you got to be able to feed your people. You got to be able to educate your people. You got to be able to go to the hospital when you're sick and find a doctor there. In many of our cities in Africa, if you go, including my home city, Dakar, if you're sick, you go to a hospital. If you don't have money, you're dead. This is serious. I just come from home because my aunt was sick.
That's right.
In 3 weeks, I had to pay $12,000. When majority of Africans, Senegalese, are making $70 to $80 a year. We have a huge population of young people, 400 million young people in the continent under 30 years old today. No jobs, no training, no future whatsoever. Last year we lost more than 3,000 young people dying on the ocean, trying to go to chase a dream that doesn't exist in Europe. Are you following what I'm trying to say here? Our education system is crumbling. Until today, in 2017, majority of young Africans, if you leave the rural areas, are living under the tree to study a day in the schools under the tree. So how can we keep those fundamental things? We don't have a good education system. We don't have a good healthcare system. We cannot feed ourselves. But then we want to build the grass-tails, buildings, and highways, and trains, and talking about the SDGs, and then how we can do free trades with the US and Europe. Well, you got to take care of it's like a building without a foundation. It doesn't stand. This is where my concerns are, how we can make sure we have a strong foundation first, because we're like 50 years behind. But we cannot skip that foundation and start building floors when we don't have a foundation. And all of these things, from energy to education, agriculture, those are the 3 points I believe we need to focus on before we talk about anything. And agriculture is tied into health, because what you eat is who you become. We used to eat bio in Africa. That's why I'm into agriculture, training young people to go back in the land to feed our people. Because now we're buying food from Europe, and all this food is refrigerated. When they come, they're selling it to us, and most of the people in Africa are getting sick today, with cancer, all kinds of stuff we didn't have. But all of these things, it cannot be done without leadership. It brings me to the next point. And you touch on it. If you don't have leadership, you cannot implement the change we need in the continent. In Africa, the richest people in my continent are politicians. The biggest and most beautiful homes in Africa are owned by politicians. If you want to be wealthy, you become a politician. They're the one traveling across the world. They're the one that control the country. And I think until we talk about the issue also of leadership, where we have leaders who lead in the intention to serve their countries, who can make the country dream and get them to work, and not wait for anybody, to come and change this country. I have not seen any country in the world that the World Bank has changed, or the United Nations. I don't see it. Maybe my friend ambassador from the UN can tell me. I have not seen any country in the world that those world and international organizations had come and changed it for them. But I've seen some countries that it was changed by the children of those countries. Israel had the same issues that we had. They had genocide. They don't have the natural resources we had. How come Israel in less than 50 years, 60 years, is where they are today? It's hard work. You believe in yourself, you use the human capacity, and you work. But we, depending on you, Europe and you, the United States, to come and change Africa, and I know you ain't going to do it. Because even if you give me a speech, you make me believe that, yeah, we're coming to help you change Africa. I know you're coming for your pocket. It's normal. It's business. It's okay. I want you to come for your pocket. But I'm just warning you here that when you come under our new leadership, under this new generation, you will come like you come into America. I don't see any foreign leader coming to the U.S., breaking the laws, trying to do business. You end up in jail. I see businesses that come to Africa don't even respect their corporate social responsibilities. They're coming in with cash, buying politicians. You do it in America, you end up in prison. But those to be able to implement those policies, you need leadership. And this is where I'm working on, to train young people to the education and training through my foundation, for them to understand our responsibility and what are we carrying on, the legacy of the great Nkrumah and Nelson Mandela. If it wasn't for leadership, I don't think Nelson Mandela will challenge the status quo of those dark nights in South Africa. But I knew he knew that he had to lead, even if it means to sacrifice. Those pioneers that was coming in America with no lights, no nothing at those times, taking the waters from Europe. When it was hard in Ireland, there was nothing going on in Europe. They looked to come here and find new land with nothing. In less than 200 years, they built it. But let me tell you this to close, though. In my land, we have 30% of the world's natural resources. More than anybody in the world. So if we cannot succeed, I cannot blame always the past, well, because slavery, because, no, it's excuses. I mean, come on. We've got to change it, period. And I'm not talking to you. I'm talking about any young African watching me from wherever you are around the world. Stop blaming everybody for our problems. The past is the past. There's history about it. Okay, cool. But now, we're grown. And things need to change. How come Emirates, I was just in Doha the other day, and I'm looking, I'm like, look at this. They have only few natural resources compared to everything in Africa. A desert is nothing, and look how they've changed it in less than 40 years. We can do that in Africa. We can do it.
I think you've sparked a lot. Actually, Flory, I think you...
You can clap, it's okay.
No, I wanted to just add a couple of points to what he said.
All right.
Going back to what I was saying about no amount of education can change you unless your mind is in the right place. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine if we can just have a few more Africans like him? And that's what we're talking about, that we need Africans who get it. A leader is as good as the people he is leading. So I am challenging the diaspora to say, don't just sit back and shoot out complaints. Don't be an empty bucket that's making noise. You got to get involved. So the diaspora, if you're listening, we need you to go home and participate in the process.
That's true.
Because the truth is, for true change to come to Africa, it has to be brought by the Africans. So thank you. We need more like you, and that's what I'm talking about.
Thank you. Bravo.
Flory, I think, let me just bring Flory in.
Maybe I'm the lone voice in this, but I actually, I mean, Tio and I haven't had the opportunity to meet you before, but I've met a lot of people like you. And I don't think that Africa is bereft of really smart, entrepreneurial people with talents. I feel like I've met lots of them, and that there are many more that are already there. So, I mean, not to say that we don't need more, I'm just saying that we do have more. And I think that on leadership, maybe there are other views, but you know, long ago when I started focusing on Africa and doing business with Africa, things were very different on the continent. And through the years, in my opinion, and documented by lots of other organizations and the Mo Ibrahim Index and you know, so forth, we have pockets of issues in terms of governance on the continent, but as a whole, I think that the trajectory has really gone in the right direction. I've been privileged to sit with President Kagame, who's the incoming AU chair, also responsible for the whole reform effort at the AU. And I personally believe that not just for 2018, but going forward, that there's a future, a bright future for Africa. You know, it's really not even a bright future. There's already a powerful base of good leaders across the continent who are doing the right things. And I think that, you know, to the point I want to get to, I think that's why there are so many business people from around the world who look at Africa. And yes, maybe there are some there to do good, but I think most of them are there to do well. And I actually don't have an issue with that, because every country in the world that is developed today is where it is because others from the outside, including the U.S., have had people who have come and invested, folks who have seen the opportunities to build railroads and, you know, auto industries and manufacturing and services sectors, all of which have driven industrialization and economic growth all across the world. And so, you know, I've had the privilege of visiting probably more factories in Africa than probably anybody. I love doing it. I love seeing it, from factories, quote unquote, with 10 people to factories with 5,000 people. And I believe, I was saying earlier to the group, one of the things I was noticing in the report was this concept that Africa will sort of leapfrog manufacturing. And yes, we all know that services contributes more to African GDP today than probably anything else. Services, finances, telecom, et cetera. But, forgive me for being a bit irreverent, but the people who say that, Africa isn't going to have, an industrial revolution as most other developed countries in the world have had, here's my question. Here's what I've said to Africans. Until all of us are walking around with no clothes on, no shoes on, men don't wear ties, nobody needs fabric, everything, the chair you're sitting on was made in a factory somewhere. This tray here was made in a factory somewhere. These chairs we're sitting in. So, forgive me for being a bit irreverent, but I don't buy that we're going to skip Africa as one of the factory floor places of the world and go straight to services, and that all of the hundreds of thousands of jobs, millions of jobs that could be created on the continent, producing the things that everybody needs. We're not going to be in a world where we don't need, telephones. I see people with their phones and so forth. So until we're in a world where we don't need physical goods, we don't need clothes, we don't need shoes, then maybe we talk about skipping Africa in the manufacturing and industrial revolution. But I personally, having visited lots of African factories, many with youth and women in those factories, in fact, most of the people in those factories are youth and women, I'm of the view that there is a bright future that we're already seeing evolving on the continent. And I'm not against services and other sectors that are important, but I'm just saying I don't believe that Africa is going to miss its turn. Everybody else in the world, every other region in the world has had its turn to produce the products that we need. And, I believe that we're going to see in Africa that will produce more automobiles and more white goods. I don't know if you all remember this, and I will stop, but, back when I was a little girl, you would go to Delancey Street in New York, and all the stuff that was produced there for, party favors and all the little junky stuff and trinkets said made in Japan. It did. And, but, eventually the Japanese got out of making those kinds of products, and, now they're making the automobile. So why do we think that Africa won't be able to evolve along similar lines? I mean, what's the reason why they're incapable of, being a part of that whole process and evolution on the continent? As I said, maybe I'm just naive, but I don't buy it. And I think that, we need to be attracting investment into, and I see it happening, into sectors that go beyond petroleum and raw commodities and so forth, and supporting Africa in being a part of global value chains where they are producing maybe not the final product, but the inputs for products. And, you may not be the country that produces the manufactures the final or assembles the final automobile, but what if you were the country that produced all of the mirrors, and everybody knew to go to X country in Africa for the mirrors in automobiles? That's what happens now. You take apart a car and you've got products from, 15 different countries in there. So anyway, I'm challenging that, and I'm also saying that I think there is a bright future for Africa that already has a foundation that if you go to the right places, visit the right spots, you will see, and represented by people like Tion here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it.
We need to go to audience questions. I love these conversations where the moderator becomes superfluous, where everyone just has so much to chime in with. It's fantastic. But we do want to let all of you have a chance. So I think what we'll do is we'll take 3 at a time. I see the gentleman in the back, and I think that we have microphones that are going around. So maybe somebody can come back to him, and the 2 of you here. So can we get, whoever gets the microphone first, we'll go with that.
Thank you. Hi. I am with Core Africa, which is a private effort to create a African Peace Corps program. And I agree with everything. It's a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Is there an effort, a focus on philanthropy in Africa to match the efforts so that Africans own their own development, along with the investments and the focus on the business private sector? Is there an effort to get more Aliko Dangotes, Mo Ibrahims, Tony Elamehus? Is that group growing? Is there an effort to promote philanthropy as a legitimate sector and part of the solution for Africa?
Thank you. Well, go ahead. We'll take 3 questions, and then we'll have some discussion. We'll take another 3. Right. We're going to go here, and then you.
Thank you for your speakers. Thank you for your perspective. Kensi Pukuta from Chris Consulting and KP Empire. As you mentioned, energy and vibrance of the African youth leaders is one of the greatest assets the continent has to offer, and we must use it as such. Yes, it is important to have plans and projects that are attainable and have potential to be well developed, but for these projects to really work and really be successful as we hope, it is essential to appeal to other Africans, especially the youth. As a group that presented at the African Development Bank called Agriculture is Cool mentioned, it really has to be important to appeal to the youth, to make them say, yes, I want to do this. Yes, this is cool. Yes, I am proud to be African. So my question is, what is your take on how I can instill this pride? And I mean pride to be an African into my fellow other Africans abroad or in Africa or in France, mes frères et sœurs, my brothers and sisters, how we say. How could we instill this pride in others?
Thank you. And we'll take a 3rd question.
Okay, my name is Dr. Bala Hapti-Jesus. I represent Global Diaspora Group for GPS. By GPS, we mean good governance, progressive prosperity, sustainable security and development. And one of the things we are concerned about is the future of Africa in terms of the leadership of young people. 80% millennials, 51% what we refer to divine feminines. I'm happy to see 3 women there and 3 young people there. But some of the challenges we have in Africa is about vision in terms of image. We just heard from our president here calling Africa what you think Africa is. And this is a prevailing opinion. And to change that paradigm, we need what I call to retire the global greedy geriatric mere goons who actually own or usurp 90% of the global resources and create man-made and human disasters or natural disasters around the world. And Africa is the best place for that. If you see at the leadership in Africa, they're all geriatric male goons above 70 years of age. And I'm a physician, I can tell you, after the age of 50, you can remember our Obama president, he started at 44. By the time he was 50, he could not even read. That means physiologically, anatomically, functionally, we're not able to lead after 50. Whereas yes, I know, this is very radical. It's the truth.
Like, hold on.
It's the truth. Our young people who are very intelligent, challenged, especially the women, I'm saying go from kindergarten to universities. In every place in Africa or around the world, the top 10 places are held by women. These young women have no future because the geriatric male goons are not going to give away. So my question is, how do we retire these geriatric male goons that are really creating havoc in Africa, one, here in America and around the world, and perhaps even putting us at the, at the breaking point of a nuclear war? And in the African setting, our young people, the most talented, intelligent ones, are going into the Mediterranean Sea and dumping themselves into the Libyan slave trade. I mean, we need to change this. And I believe, and the question I have is really...
Let me have the panelists.
Yes, my question to the panelists is, there is something called digital cryptocurrency that uses compound interest-based blockchain technology. From what you told us, the money and resources are being stolen by the middle people. Can we get the latest digital currency, call it African coin, maybe, so that African people will own their own property and not give it up to other people? And I thank you.
Thank you very much. I can see, Madam Ambassador, you are chomping at the bit for that one.
Let me start with my sister. Remind me again your quick question.
Humanitarian. If the humanitarian can
hold
do
on.
it.
What was that again?
Focus on philanthropy. Yes, so focusing on philanthropy,
African
youth
pride.
and inspiring youth, and retiring the geriatrics, and a Bitcoin for Africa. Okay, please.
Ooh, okay.
Very diverse questions. Try to wrap them all up into one answer.
Let's start with the image of Africa. Remember, young men, the image of Africa that was created during the colonial times was designed for a specific purpose. Sadly, and I'm going to put it right back at us Africans, in some cases, we are the worst enemies when it comes to promoting our own Africa. We are quick to fight. You will not find an American, and I can assure you, you go outside Africa and you run into an American, they will not allow you to put down America. So why do we allow ourselves to engage in conversations with non-Africans and we're putting down our Africa? No country is without faults. And yet when issues occur in Africa, they're put on a pedestal. The same could be happening here. I'm going to share with you, I was watching CNN years ago, 60 Minutes. There was this white American doctor who was going around the gutters of Harlem, taking care of these homeless people who were down and under. And I mean, there was filth, there was everywhere, but the peach was the good Samaritan doctor. These were horrible living conditions for Americans in Harlem. The next segment was about Lagos, but the spin this time was on the leadership. But they were the same people in the gutters in Lagos, but the spin was, how could the Nigerian government do this? There are people in the gutters, people are, but the conditions were the same. When they were in America, the spin was the good Samaritan doctor. But the same conditions prevailed in Nigeria. Oh, how can the government do this? A man in the gutter is a man in the gutter, no matter where we find them. There are things happening in this country that are not given the highlight. They are getting the highlight that they need, but they don't define America. So why are similar situations in Africa given a platform and highlighted as if it is happening all over Africa? A simple situation happening in some little corner of Africa somewhere in a country, but it is painted as if it's happening throughout Africa. We, the Africans, must defend our Africa viciously. Because there is a lot of good news coming out of Africa that is not spoken. And yet all we do is highlight the negatives. We as Africans must take a position and viciously, and I mean viciously, defend our Africa. Because if Africa is in the gutter, guess what? You're putting it in the gutter. And as an African, you have a responsibility to do something about it. That answers your question. Now in terms of How can I be proud of my Africa? You need to be proud of Africa, know your history, know where you come from, and stand up on the highest mountain and proclaim to the world who you are. A proud, handsome African man. And nobody needs to tell you that. Now, if you get out of bed and need somebody to tell you how beautiful you are and how important you are and how powerful you are as an African man, then you got a problem and you need a serious conversation with the image in the mirror.
So,
David,
And I think, okay.
Yes, thank you, Madam. I just want to build on your word of wisdom, that if you have an act of violence somewhere in Africa, it's right away a terrorist. You have an act of violence, and one killed one person, the other one killed 50. In Africa is a terrorist. In here is an alleged killer or an alleged potential disabled person. And that's the problem that we have. Madam, I agree with you, but the communication starts from home. We don't sell the stories. We don't sell that now there is more transitional and democratic countries, elected governments in the continent than ever before. We don't sell that for the 20 elections that took place in Africa, all of them, there was a transition of peaceful. There is not one single drop of blood that has, in Zimbabwe, for example, a few months ago. We don't talk about it. We are not strong enough. We are not aggressive enough. And I agree with you that Africa should have a fair trade. But in order for Africa to have a fair trade, Africa should be united. 1 billion, 2 billion people would face any bloc in the world, including China. If we speak in one voice, and only one voice, we don't have to tell them for fair trade. The fair trade will impose itself, and we'll have strategic partnership all over the world. It's not demanding or asking for ODA. It becomes a requirement. The requirements will come when we have a large market with 1.2 billion people and a very large GDP. Now, to be proud of Africa, look at what's happening in the street. Look at Tunisia. 7 years ago, the street spoke and put Ben Ali out of the country. 7 years later, they came and asked the new government to be accountable. And what's happening is turmoil everywhere in the country. They are asking to take stock of what's happening. And if the people of Tunisia have died, they wanted to have actually the results and the impact of 7 years ago. So, and that is trickling down in all African countries. You have it in Burkina Faso, you have it in Mali, you have it. So be proud of Africa because the leaders are aware of that, and more of them are leaving out, and it's not sustainable. Because why? Because the youth are connected. What's happening in Tunisia is happening in Mali. Right away, it's in South Africa. Right away, it's in Zimbabwe. So they know what's happening literally every minute in the world. In addition to that, they have an alternative. Alternative for migration is now the borders are closed. The ceilings are not actually glass ceiling, it's concrete ceilings. But they know that they have extremists, that they can knock at the door and they are willing to accept them. So would the leaders, if they are wise enough, if they know that their future is important, would they want to allow this young to be together, go to the street or the extremists, and therefore it's not sustainable. I agree that there is a gerontocracy, but it's not, it's 5 years, 10 years from now. Let's not forget that Africa has lost decades. The decades have been imposed. Most of the policies, public policy, has unfortunately been imposed by outsiders because they are donors. But now, with African taking the control, Africa has developed its own agenda. Africa is the leader. Africa is managing. Africa is mainstreaming more and more in their budget, in their plan, their own policy. I want to give you an example. Look at the malaria. The malaria pandemic has lasted a few months, and Africans were resilient enough to be able to tackle that issue. Look at the financial crisis. The financial crisis has not touched as much as Africa because Africa has well managed their macroeconomic policies. African, according to some international institutions that I would not want to talk about, tell the names, have said that African countries were much better managed economically than some European countries. So be proud of Africa because of the result. Malaria, one example. HIV/AIDS also, African has actually controlled the spread of HIV/AIDS. Be also that African has managed better the financial crisis and the aftermath was much more resilient to it. So be proud because you're African. Now about the term limits, I think the gerontocracy will not last. It's phasing out more and more. There is term limits in the constitution of the countries. As you have seen in some countries, when the president wants to move and change the constitution to actually take off the term limits, there is regional and peer pressure for Africans to actually get back to that. In addition to that, more and more peace and security issues have been tackled at the continental level. They don't ask the NATO, we don't ask the European Union, or we don't ask the UN to resolve internally all peace settlements and peace problems. So with that, be proud of Africa, and the gerontocracy is not sustainable. And to be young, I think the future is bright, because the highest GDP in the world is in African countries. We have, as I was mentioning, the illicit financial flows, 50 billion. If we can go and get that 50 billion, we are no longer depending on the ODA. And in addition to that, the continental free trade that is being launched is 1.2 billion. That's the largest market in the world, with about 500 million middle class people. Thank you very much, madam.
I'd like to answer the doctor.
We have to. Unfortunately, we are already going way over. So I'm
I
going to have
gotta answer
Flory,
that. We're gonna need 5 minutes.
You know what? I'm going to have
Yeah,
Flory talk
I gotta say something. Just give me 4 minutes. I gotta answer
I'm going to
that.
still bring you in.
Thank you very
I'm going to have Flory, and then you, and then Ibrahima, you will close it out for us. So please go ahead.
No, I'll see 4 of my 5 minutes and just say briefly that, again, I think there are enormous opportunities in Africa and the African market, and I think that U.S. companies are there, and there are more who are anxious to be there, and for good reason.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tim, please.
Oh, I can get in. Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Well, because you've so inspired us, so I wanted to bring you in, you know, those
I just wanted to make sure the young man
final
gets
wrap-up kind of
That's it.
things, you
Yeah,
know?
I think for the first, I wrote it here, the questions. The first question that you had about being proud of Africa and how we can get the young people from the diaspora to be proud to come home. I always believe that leadership is not about speeches, it's about action. And Gandhi clearly told us that you have to be the change that you want to see. In the words of President Obama, change will not happen if we are waiting for others to do it. You know what's wrong in the continent. We can sit there and talk about it all day. You have to take something that you can do and you get into it and just make it happen. When Akon and I met here in Washington, D.C., and we knew that we have to step in, we focused on energy and bring Akon Lighting Africa in the continent. We didn't stop there, because when we came to the continent, we saw that many of these young people are not qualified for most of the jobs in the energy sector. Then we launched the Solar Trade Academy in Mali, which now we're taking young people from around the continent to take them to Mali to train them to be able to install and maintain the solar light products that we're putting in. And when they finish, we hire them to work for us. Today, more than 5,000 young people in the continent working for us directly. The same thing for agriculture. When I saw that it needs to be done, I didn't say, well, I need to be proud. No. I went back to the land, and I used social media to show young Africans, especially Senegalese, that agriculture is actually cool. Because if we are followed, I got more than 130,000 young people following me on Facebook, Akon 52 million, if we can use it well, we can inspire them to do the things that they thought weren't cool. Because many young people in Africa don't do agriculture because they think it's something very old. So it's to tell you that, yes, it's possible, but you don't have to wait for anybody to tell you how great you can do for the continent, especially you from the diaspora. What you've acquired here is knowledge. You can build a project at home. For my friend in the back, interesting point. I won't use the words that you use, but I feel you, because we are at the point where, at the crossroad where we need change in leadership in many African countries. But that change is you. It's me, it's on everyone concerned. And I've learned in American politics, living here for a while, that power is not given. There's nobody who like you enough to just say, you know what, you're my friend, come on in and take this position for me, you know. You can become president now, just sit on the side. We don't see that in Africa. If you want power, you have to fight for it. These people are there for years because there's not enough people challenging it. That calls for a new generation of leaders who will make the sacrifices to leave their comfort in America, to leave their comfort in London and in France, for those who are watching from Europe, just like our founding fathers did. They left their comfort after school and went home and sacrificed. But many of our people in the diaspora will tell you, oh, no, I'm not living the comfort here, going there with this crazy stuff. I'm not doing it. As soon as they come home, they're already planning to get back after 2 weeks. And most of us are doing nothing but just criticizing on Facebook and Twitter. We have a lot of activists over there. But we have very few people coming in the continent and making the work happen on the ground. That's where we need you guys the most. Because if you have enough people coming in, change doesn't take many. It just takes 1, 2 people who are dedicated can drive the change we need. Mandela was only one of a few who made the sacrifices. Today, you see what he's brought to the continent. So you guys are the change we want, we need today, not tomorrow. You've got to come on the continent and build the projects so we can help move this continent and change it forward. Because I dream every day of what's possible here. When I go to the small villages and see women like my mother's age who at night can't go to the doctors. If you're having a baby in the middle of the night, there's no roads to take you anywhere. There is no poste de santé or healthcare system in the continent, in the country. Many people dying every single day of small things like malaria. There is no energy anywhere. Education, millions of young people are desperate. They don't know what to do with their lives. This is heavy in my heart. This is personal. These are my people. And I can't wait for the World Bank to come and change that. Because it's not their role. It's my role. And it's your role, our responsibility. If we think we're comfortable here in America enough to just leave our people live in those conditions, and then we are blaming the past, or somebody's making some comments in the US about who we are, and we can go out in the streets and actually protest about it, because the president is telling us who we are, whatever he's making of us, it's not my problem. Because my problem is, I want to fix home. It doesn't matter what you say about me. If you tell me you're white, you can tell me white all day, but if you look at me, you know I'm not white. Because I don't have, all they're saying, because they said it clearly. Un tigre n'a pas besoin de réclamer sa tigritude. A tiger doesn't need to say, well, I'm a tiger. But let's talk honestly. We have some serious problems in the continent that need to be fixed. And it will not be fixed until the children of the continent be aware of what's awaiting for us, as everyone else has done in every part of the world. This is my struggle. This is my fight. And this is what I took on. And I know there are sacrifices. But I know me and my generation, and those who think like me, as you said you met, are ready for that. And in a few years, we'll change it.
Thank you so much. Prima, if you want to just say some closing remarks. Unfortunately, we are out of time for audience questions. I apologize for that, but I also had a million questions I didn't get to ask. So it's just such a dynamic discussion. It's hard to get in there. So please, go ahead.
Yes, I'll be brief, so I won't stay in between you and lunch. So I think it's been a quite fascinating discussion. As someone has remarked that you look at Africa, the whole continent itself looks like there's quite a few paradoxes going on, and that the continent itself is shaped like a question mark. And Madagascar is just misplaced. That's another paradox about it. And I think in the discussion here, we've highlighted a couple of them. There are many more. For example, why is it that we have 60% of the world arable land, yet we import roughly $35 billion worth of food, right? And why is it that Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana control about 60% or so of the cocoa market, but yet the farmers in those countries make less than 10 cents on the dollar in terms of what they produce? So those are just some of the paradoxes. And the answer to all of this, again, comes back to the central theme of this foresight, is about leadership. And the leadership to actually lead the way, and then to empower those who are capable of doing it, And with the energy and vibrancy of the young people, as illustrated here by Sion's interventions, clearly that's an asset that needs to really be harnessed. And as well as harnessing the potential of women is also very critical. Something that's less known about Asia's development model is that it wasn't just about bringing rural farmers into industry, but also bringing women into industry. So all of a sudden, you had 2 wage earners. And that was really important in being able to quickly transform the country. So certainly inclusion of women and the young people, empowering them, and giving them the platform to really unleash their creativity will be critical for Africa's future. But I'm quite optimistic because as somebody once told me, I'm a structural optimist. So, and I really believe in the potential of the continent.
I join you.
And it's good to see leadership continentally now coming together, as illustrated by the contributions from the head of the main 3 continental institutions. And the reaction to some statement made about Africa was quite swift. And I liked the spontaneity and then the unification Africa showed in responding to it. And to that, I would basically say that's been one of the positive things that's come out of all of this. But ultimately, I think Africa will not be defined by what anybody else says. Africa will be defined by Africans. And leadership is what's going to take us there.
That's great. Beautiful. Good job, brother.
And a fascinating discussion. And I think, this theme of unleashing is really important. We've heard about African institutions unleashing their power, the power of international institutions, supporting that and working with them, the power of the private sector in partnering, and then the power of individual initiatives and what can be done. And what I want to encourage everybody in the audience and joining us online is thinking yourself about how you can unleash your own potential to be working with Africa, to be partnering with Africans to make this, to help unleash even further. There is a multiplier effect in what we all do. And with that, I want to just close with what you had said, which I thought was so beautifully put: dream every day what is possible. And that is what we should all be doing on Africa. So with that, I want to thank all of the panelists. This has been fascinating. I've loved listening to all of this. I want to thank Brookings and especially the Africa Growth Initiative and Dr. Brahima Coulibaly, who has brought this all together.
Bravo. Beautiful, brother.
And Amy.
Good job.
Our guest on This is America in the World is Dr. Arikana Shihambori Kwao. Her Excellency is the ambassador representing the African Union in the United States, and she's chair of the African Union African Diaspora Health Initiative. The ambassador has practiced medicine in Tennessee for 25 years.
Madam Ambassador, so good to sit with you today.
Thank you for having me.
But talk about Africa. When you look at Africa today, what do you see?
I see an amazing continent, a continent that is endowed with everything and anything the world could ever need. I see a continent that is full of hope, a continent that has some of the most incredible, resilient people I've ever met. When you really honestly look at what Africa and these people have been through, most other ethnic groups would be extinct by now. But we are resilient. We are human beings who are just so committed to survive against all odds. But nonetheless, we are waking up. We're also a continent that's been sleeping. Let me say we were put to sleep. We were awake, and then we were put to sleep. Now it's time that we wake up back to our greatness again.
What is the damage that has been sustained because of colonial rule and apartheid?
Whew. Let's go back to, I guess, when you look at colonialism and when it was finally just organized in a way that we would then have the Africa that we have today. For Africa, I'll take it back to the Berlin Conference. That was held from November of 1884 to February of 1885. As you know, most people don't realize that the European nations were just haphazardly going into Africa and just stealing from the local people, and pretty soon they started stealing. The British would steal from the French, and the French would steal from the Spaniards, and pretty soon they were fighting each other. So the then Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, in his efforts to prevent the European war on the African soil, he reached out to his sidekick, King Leopold of Belgium. And at that time, as you know, Belgium, King Leopold was wreaking havoc in the Congo. People are not aware that over 75% of the Congolese population was killed by Leopold. He actually claimed Congo was his own personal country. He owned it individually, not as Belgium. So you call Leopold and say, hey, we got a problem here. Can we come together and see if we can organize the manner in which we're going to loot from these people? So that's really how Berlin Conference was called together. So they brought all the countries that were making this mad rush into Africa so they could organize how they were looting the continent. So really, the Berlin Conference was not called for in order to make Africa better, but rather to see to it that they organize themselves so they can effectively exploit the Africans and also make sure that the continent and its people are forever defeated and dominated.
Does the looting go on today?
Oh, yes. The looting continues, but it has put on different clothes. Now, there's something else they did during the Berlin Conference. Because remember, after they had traveled around the continent, found some of the most powerful kingdoms with well-established educational and religious systems. I mean, the African people are just resilient. When you get to know the Africans, you understand the African spirit. And they knew that if they continued the same way they were going, they would never defeat the Africans. So they set in place a system of colonization and making the Africans believe that everything that was African was bad and everything that was European, particularly British and English, was better. So the seed of divide and conquer was also sown during the Berlin Conference. And they knew, just give it a generation or less, these people, not only are they going to be so divided, because they chopped us up into these small economies that really could never survive on their own. You take a country like Equatorial Guinea, Central African Republic, Malawi, Rwanda, Burundi, you know, they're economies that even if they struggle and begin to do better on their own, if the master decides you're becoming too smart, they're very easy to destabilize.
Wow.
And that's exactly what has been going on in our Africa. So Berlin Conference, people don't realize it was designed to see to it that the Africans are forever defeated. So for those who turn around and say, but Ambassador, don't talk about the Berlin Conference, it was a long time ago. And I'll say, as long as we have a country called Malawi, a country called Zimbabwe, a country called Central African Republic, all the African countries really for that matter, Berlin Conference is alive and well. Because that which they set out to do 123, 24 years ago, it's still in place. Nothing has changed. So how can they say Berlin Conference is a thing of history, don't talk about it? No, what's really sad and what should disgust the world is to say this policy was put in place 123 years ago and it is still in place and nothing has changed. But what's really worse is when you look at what France did to the Francophone countries in 1958, when they were living, quote unquote, leaving the continent. They gave the Francophone countries two choices. You can be independent with some affiliations to France, or you can be independent with no affiliations to France. Well, Guinea and Mali said, we're done with you, France, goodbye, leave us alone. That's how we had the first ever known union of any African states. They went into those two countries, took everything that they thought they had brought to them. History tells us they even took the last cup, teaspoon, chair, and proceeded to pour concrete into the sewage pipes, completely devastating the two economies, simply because they refused to be affiliated to France. But what they, and also the Sékou Touré, then president of Guinea at that time, he looked at the pact that France was making the Francophone countries sign. It was called the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. He refused to sign it.
How many countries in Africa?
Now we are sitting at 14 Francophone countries that are still held on to this pact.
So in the 50-some countries in Africa altogether, were they all colonized?
Yes.
By different
countries?
Different countries.
The majority of the countries went to France,
yes,
Britain. We have Portuguese, we have Spanish, and those are the main ones.
You used the word looting before.
Yes.
The looting continues to this day?
To this day, it continues, but it has a different name.
So tell me what the name is.
Well, the exploitation of Africa continues. Again, let me go back to the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, which is the biggest one. The Francophone countries were told because we brought you the idea that you can sit at a table and eat with a fork and knife, we brought you tea, we built some roads and told you about going to school, we're going to call that colonial debt. So there's a fee for that, and you need to pay for it. They were also told that you must speak French as your official language, and it must be your language of instruction in schools, and we will be the one to design your educational system. And then also, your money. 85% of your bank reserves, you will keep them, you'll deposit them with the French bank, and we will take that money and invest it in the French stock market, but we don't have to tell you what the returns are on your money. So collectively, all the Francophone countries that signed that pact, their funds, the 85% of their bank reserves, are invested under French name.
Got to hold that because we're getting behind on a little break. We are talking with the ambassador who represents the African Union here in the United States. And Her Excellency is giving us an amazing look inside Africa back then and today. Sit tight. This is America and the World.
This is America and the World is brought to you by Whittle School and Studios, the U.S.-China Education Trust and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Julia Chang Block, President, the League of Arab States, the Republic of Haiti, the Rotendaro Family Trust, Japan, History, Hospitality, and Advanced Technology, sharing tomorrow. The Forerunner Foundation, dedicated to forward-thinking public policy. And the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings.
Madam Ambassador, about 50 countries, a little bit more, 50 countries?
55.
55. Population of Africa?
1.27 billion.
1.27 billion people. Give me a couple of success stories.
Success stories, we are having increased rates of literacy. We have many African countries that are increasing their GDPs. 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. So there's a lot of good news coming out of Africa. But again, because of this same strategy of branding Africa as a diseased and dying continent where people are constantly at war with each other, people are not seeing the good news out of Africa.
So what are the myths? What are the myths about Africa? Just name 3 things that we should get in our minds that when Africa is in the conversation or Africa is in the news, that we should be thinking about. 3 myths.
1, Africa is the richest continent on earth by far.
Hello?
Yes. No continent comes even close. 1. 2, we are all Africans because life began in Africa. Life as we know it, I can tell you, my brother, right now, you do your DNA testing, I can tell you a good 50% of you is African. We are all Africans. And thirdly...
Proud to be.
Proud. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then thirdly, I want everybody to know about the wonderful news coming out of Africa. Remember we were talking about the Berlin Conference, how we were designed to fail through these little countries we were divided up? Well, guess what? Game is over. April this year, we saw our leaders come together and signing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Yes.
Yes, so we have 50 countries that have already signed, and we're going through the process of ratifications. We only need 22 of the 50 to ratify. Already we have 10 ratifications deposited with the African Union.
So free trade agreement in Africa.
In Africa.
For African countries.
We're going to negotiate as one bloc. We have made a commitment as Africans that the only way we can survive, which is what our Pan-African fathers wanted, to speak with one voice, one continent, one voice. And that's, we're finally getting there. We're finally beginning to bury the Berlin Conference.
Okay, African Union. What is it? What is it all about?
African Union. Remember when our Pan-African leaders met in 1964 and created OAU? It was during that wonderful Organization of African Unity. That's when Kwame Nkrumah proclaimed Africa was for the Africans and African Union now. 55 years later, we are yet to attain that perfect African Union. But that's okay, we are getting there. He also proclaimed, you were not African because you were born in Africa, but rather you were African because Africa is born in you. Now, this is the most beautiful part. Yes.
Nice.
As I've lived in this country, I've met many people who may never have been born in Africa or never have even set foot in Africa, but they have Africa born in them. So I see a lot of brothers and sisters who may not look like me, but they're definitely Africans. Since 1964, after the creation of the OAU, the whole purpose of the OAU was to rebuild the Africa and destroy the boundaries that were imposed upon us during the Berlin Conference. It's been difficult because remember that seed of divide and conquer. It's deep among us. Trying to get us to work together. We are so divided among tribal lines, religious lines, even now racial lines and national lines. So we are very divided people. But getting us to realize that we are suffering from the legacy of colonialism is work in progress. We must keep preaching. People must have a serious conversation with the image in the mirror because the healing starts here.
How about your job, your mission?
My mission, I have sent here by the 55 African heads of states and my chairman, Musa Faki Mahamat, 2 major mandates: to promote Africa in the Americas and also to strengthen the bridges between Africa and the Americas and to bring the children of the diaspora back home.
There are challenges, of course.
Yes, there are.
Poverty still.
Yes,
Conflict, literacy, but education moving along. Health. You're a physician. You're a physician.
That is a serious problem. People are not aware. If all the continental African doctors were to return home today, we're only going to meet about 20% of the need. Africa needs at least 1.2 million doctors today. So as you can imagine, no amount of money put into healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa is going to deliver the desired results because the capacity is simply not there. There are more African doctors, Ghanaian African doctors, in New York City alone than in the whole country. The same is true with Nigeria and many other countries. The same is true with education and all other sectors. The capacity that Africa needs to take its rightful place on the world stage is in the diaspora. And this is because of the brain drain. And the brain drain goes back to starting with the ones that came across the Atlantic in shackles, followed by the ones who came across the Atlantic in search of greener pastures. The result is the only ingredient that is missing for Africa to move forward are its children. So that is why the African heads of states and the African Union Commission are committed to see to it that we repatriate, we reverse the brain drain.
This is a heavy-duty sentence that I've picked up in some of your interviews, past interviews. It's not easy being a black person on Earth.
It is not.
Can you talk about that, please?
In my own humble opinion, I like to say the most endangered species on Earth is the black man, followed by the black woman right above them. It doesn't matter. You just have to be. You simply just have to be. I can tell you one experience I had not even long ago. My daughter got married, and it was in Maine. And after the wedding, the wedding party wanted to go to a nightclub. Now, the only black people were my son, my daughter, and another guest, another young black girl. Anyway, and the rest, she married a white guy, so the wedding party was his friends from high school and college. Well, the young kids were already drunk. So when they were trying to get into the nightclub, there were about 15 of them. And the police were called. But my daughter heard them say, and my son is very tall. And so there's a tall black guy and a young lady in a pink dress. They were the only two black people. Mm. And when the police came, they wanted to talk to those two. But the question is, they're all here. So fortunately, one of the brides maid, she's a newly graduated Harvard lawyer. Mm. And she walked right up to the police and said, I want you to know I'm a Harvard lawyer. I have you. I'm recording you. Go right ahead. So the police completely changed their demeanor.
Sure.
But what was called in were the two black people.
Sure.
They were not even drunk. It's the rest of the party that was drunk. But so you don't have to do anything. Sometimes you just have to be. Yeah. Just be yourself and you're in trouble. But really what gets me mad is, even on the continent, we get abused on our own land simply because of the color of our skin. Mm. So it's really something that I would like for people to stop and think about. When are we going to be free as black people?
I want to insert one other thought into the conversation. And what we're talking about now is very important. You've been practicing medicine in Tennessee for 25 years?
Yes.
Yep. I read something which said, talking about African Americans and Africans in the United States. They're saying that it is very difficult and it is a daily task for a black person to fit into white society.
Absolutely. But the question is, here's the way I look at it. Why should we even try to fit into anything? This is our world. I don't need to try to fit in anything. I just want to get along with you.
Yeah.
I don't need to try to fit in anything. Right. And if you don't want to get along with me, fine, have it your way.
Right.
We need to, the reason we feel like we should fit in is because we are coming into this conversation from a level of inferiority.
Yeah.
Why do we feel inferior?
And a superiority on the part of the white.
Thank you. So we're coming in feeling inferior, they're coming in feeling superior. There is no conversation between white and black. Mm. That needs to be addressed, and we must pull this bull by the horns. As black people, we need to move up and realize that we're just as good as anybody else, and the white people need to get off their high horses and come down. So we can have a real meaningful conversation, much needed conversation. And that's part of why I'm here, because I realize there's so much misunderstanding between Africans do not understand the Americans do not understand the Africans. It gets in the way of trade. If you look at AGOA implementation, that simple legislation that is meant to help African businesses, we're not benefiting from it because when the African businesses hear about doing business in America, America is so hard. No, honey, it may be a lot of papers, but all you gotta do is cross every T and dot every I, one page at a time, and you'll get it done. But because it's America, there's a wall that falls, and it's difficult.
You're representing the African Union in the United States.
Correct.
On a scale of 0 to 10, what's the relationship between Africa and the United States?
I can honestly tell you right now, and I'm preaching whenever I have an audience to preach, America is still the most preferred trading partner by Africa. Mm-hmm. But my biggest fear right now, I see America slowly losing its place. I often say...
Its place where?
In Africa, in terms of being preferred. Because America is still...
On a scale of 0 to 10?
On a scale of 0 to 10, America is still number one.
Well, that's the desire, but how would you say the relationship is between the two countries? Number one?
It's still good.
Ah.
That's what I'm saying. So caution is to say, America, in order for you to maintain your position, this game is a new game. You need to call for timeout. You need to re-strategize.
President Trump is a businessman.
Yes.
How do you sell a businessman on the importance of Africa?
Well, I think President Trump is a businessman who likes to negotiate, and he wants to always end up with the upper hand, and I don't blame him. That's why Americans appointed him. He is there to come out with the best deal for America, period. And he wants to get that deal by any means necessary. We, the Africans, must also stand up and realize that if you're going to negotiate with America, you better be on your P's and Q's. You must have all your antennas up and be ready to fight, because the Americans are not going to come in and let you just beat up on them. But at the same time, let me look at it this way as well. Going back to the Berlin Conference, we are already at a disadvantage. How do you take Togo and put Togo in the same boxing ring with the United States? You're taking a heavyweight fighter and putting them in the same ring with not even a lightweight fighter, but a wannabe boxer. This is the position that African countries are finding themselves in. They are not heavyweights. These are little boys who are constantly being put in the same heavyweight boxing ring with the big boys. Now, when we come together as a continent, as Africa, we are a heavyweight. We belong in the same boxing ring with the United States, with China, with India, with Europe.
Rightful place? Going for the rightful place.
Rightful place, because right now we vacated that place and others have been taking that place. Game is up. Africa must take its rightful place as one continent, one heart, one voice.
Will we see a new Africa?
It's going to happen. Absolutely. It's on the way. I was talking to my chairman just last week. He told me January we'll have all the ratifications we need, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is moving, is steaming right ahead. And the children of Africa are going to speak with one voice. And our Pan-African fathers from 1964, wherever they are in their graves, they are doing flips, because finally Africa is going to be whole again.
So you have hope?
Very much so. That's all we got.
What are we missing?
The understanding and appreciation of Africa and its people.
What's the biggest lesson you've learned in your life?
The biggest lesson I've learned in my life is that love conquers all. And that if we can just love each other and accept each other as humanity, regardless of the color of your skin, because this really is, the color of your skin is nothing. At the end of the day, we are one. So if we can just learn to love and respect and appreciate each other, this world is an amazing place.
So when we look at the news, television, or hear it on radio, or pick up a newspaper, one thought you want us to take. One thought.
Africa is an amazing continent. And everything that you have heard, read, negative about Africa, it is all false. Take another look at Africa with a clean eye.
Take another look at Africa with a clean eye.
Absolutely.
Lovely. Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for the education.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you
for
for
coming.
having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Toussaint Louverture. My name is perhaps known to you.
He was called the Black George Washington. He fought off 3 empires and enraged Napoleon.
The prospect of a black republic is equally disturbing to the Spanish, the English, and the Americans.
He championed liberty and égalité for all. Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Haiti is always described as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But during its height at Saint-Domingue, it was the richest place in the Americas. The thing about it, though, is that its richness was all rooted in slaves. Its wealth was based on human capital, on owning that human capital.
All day, as long as the sun is shining, the men are bending over and swaying a machete at the foot of the sugarcane.
The world as you know it disappears. Therefore, you become an animal, and you expect to live like an animal.
The dominion of the master had to be absolute, but that absoluteness itself made the master into something other than human as well.
Liberty, equality, fraternity, that was new for the world.
Toussaint Louverture is the epitome of humanity. He realized early on that the condition he was in was totally insufferable.
Toussaint Louverture recruited about 3,000 to 4,000 people, trained them, and they fought the French, the British, and the Spanish army for 12 years.
They burned the mechanisms of their production. They're burning the plantation fields, burning down the houses.
It was a wholesale massacre on a really, really enormous scale. It was a big, big, major payback time.
The Haitian Revolution is probably the most profound revolution ever realized by human beings. The only place where slaves created a nation. But nobody wants to talk about it.
In the summer of 1789, when Haiti was still the dormant colony of Saint-Domingue, it was France that grabbed the world's attention. Parisian mobs rioted against the French king and against their own desperate poverty. Chanting slogans for liberty, equality, and brotherhood, they sparked a revolution that would fill history books for centuries to come.
The trick about the French Revolution was that it meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
In the streets of Paris, the French Revolution meant an end to the appalling privileges of wealth. And France's brand new Congress, called the National Assembly, it meant the ideas of Europe's most radical thinkers could be realized.
Nobody knows exactly what's going to come out of it, but just the idea of having rights, right? The idea that all people have rights, that those rights are inherent. This was something that obviously philosophers had written about before, but during the course of the French Revolution, it was written down in a text called the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
It's a dangerous idea because the society is based on inequality. That's what makes it work, because it was not supposed to work for everybody. It was supposed to work for a minority.
What was a dangerous idea in France was even more dangerous in its slave-holding colonies off the coast of Florida, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and an island known as the Pearl of the Antilles. Today, the western half is Haiti. Then it was the French colony of Saint-Domingue.
One thing that's fascinating about that time, people think things were very far away. They were not. News traveled very, very fast.
We have to remember that the ocean was like a highway in the 18th century. I mean, the ships were constantly bringing news back and forth. Everyone was obsessed with news. sailors would come off the ships, the first people they would talk to, the people they would work with as they were unloading the ships, were enslaved people. So there are reports who are describing the events that have been going on in Paris to the enslaved that are working alongside of them.
Few intended colonial slaves should take democratic ideas to heart. Far too much was at stake. Sugar greased the wheels of the 18th century economy, and Saint-Domingue was the sugar capital of the world. It was easy, even for France's political radicals, to ignore the agony that made it all possible.
The leaves of the sugarcane are just like minuscule saw. If they cut you, you may not even see it. But when you perspire, the sweat gets in it and it burns. In the roots, there are ants. They bite. And when they bite you, you will scratch yourself for half a day.
If the worker refuses to work, well, there is a law which you just shoot him, that's all.
The whole concept of slavery itself is a totally savage one. The French, they brought it down to science. A slave coming from Africa would not last 3 years, the way the system was organized. They had it down to that kind of statistics. They did it very systematically, and it was very successful.
Slavery in Saint-Domingue succeeded too on a foundation of relentless terror. Slave owner Stanislas Saint-Fouache explained it as rational management.
Slow punishments make a greater impression than quick or violent ones. Rather than 50 lashes administered in 5 minutes, 25 lashes of the whip administered in a quarter of an hour. This is far more likely to make an impression.
The accounts about the tortures inflicted on slaves are often horrifying. Legs cut off or arms cut off, amputations for runaways, rubbing hot powder or pepper and so forth into the wounds. Slaves actually hung and left to die. You can kind of imagine that this kind of world in which essentially human life was given so little value that these tortures were kind of refined to this incredible, cruel effect.
Despite the brutal tools of control, some blacks managed to escape slavery. Many had been born free, fathered by white planters. Others had gained freedom through their own wits or talents. One such man was Toussaint Louverture.
I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man.
Toussaint Louverture was a very determined man. He was a very ambitious man. And in my opinion, he was a genius.
Toussaint is, I think, one of the most incredible figures that I know about in many ways. He's born on a plantation in Saint-Domingue. He grows up on that plantation.
That plantation was owned by a man who was tolerant for the times. Toussaint was taught to read and write as a child.
He eventually occupies a somewhat privileged role, if you can say that, on a plantation as a coachman, and has a kind of relationship with the managers and masters in some ways. He becomes free in the 1770s, so he's somebody who kind of occupied different roles in society. And I think that's the key for understanding Toussaint, is that he saw possibilities where other people didn't.
He had businesses, had contacts in the US and elsewhere, bank accounts, managed his affairs pretty well. The man was endless in organizational capacity. I mean, he would have been a fantastic CEO today.
Toussaint didn't record his first reactions to the revolution in France, but his fellow free Saint-Dominguans, the white colonials, and the mixed-race population were transfixed.
In 1789, there were about 40,000 white people and about 30,000 colored people who were, of course, their sons and cousins and so on and so forth, who were landowners themselves, many of them slave owners themselves, many of them very effective businessmen, many of them involved romantically with the white master class.
One of the things that's important to remember about Haiti and race is it wasn't simply black and white. Instead, you had numerous gradations of color. One historian went so far as to give 110 categories of color, from absolute black to absolute white. And to each combination, he gave a name: mulatto, quadroon, Mamaluke. And what he was accounting for was the drops of black blood.
Whites hoped for more control over the colony's governance, but the colony's mixed-race population hoped for more fundamental changes. They had been born free, but not equal.
They had to show physical respect for the white. Stand up when they are in presence of a white, call them Mr. or whatever title they wanted to have. It was not easy for them, and that's exactly why they were the first one, before the blacks, they were the first one to ask for equality.
The mixed-race population of Saint-Domingue decided their chance had come in 1791. They sent a petition to France's new government asking for the rights of citizenship.
This is a powerful message to have been taking place in a society that was explicitly organized on inequality. It's like dynamite.
The petition asked for civil protections, and it enraged the island's white population. Working-class colonists began a full-scale intimidation campaign. They threatened, beat, and murdered mixed-race residents in the capital. But the petition met a different reception back in Paris. The new breed of delegates in the National Assembly issued a landmark decree. They extended equal rights to the small population of mixed-race people born of two free parents. Despite the reform's limited extent, the governor of Saint-Domingue refused to obey. Colonial whites felt profoundly betrayed. Some, such as a planter's wife named Madame de Rouvray, began discussing radical thoughts of their own.
The National Assembly is committed to destroying our lives as masters, so much so that secession from France might be necessary. The slave owners of America, I hope, will band together to stop this contagion of liberty.
The good Lord who created the sun which gives us light from above, who rouses the sea and makes the thunder roar, watches us.
Boukman Dati was a slave and a voodoo priest.
Throw away the image of the God of the whites who thirsts for our tears, and listen to the voice of liberty which speaks in the hearts of all of us.
In August 1791, as Saint-Domingue's white and mixed-race population squared off for a showdown, Boukman called together slaves from neighboring plantations. They'd been kidnapped from different parts of Africa, and the voodoo religion was their common culture.
Le vaudou, c'est l'esprit de nos ancêtres, c'est une religion. C'est le mode de vie de l'haïtien. C'est plus qu'une religion, c'est notre façon de vivre, c'est notre force. Le vaudou est libérateur, le vaudou est dignité, le vaudou est sagesse, et le vaudou, c'est notre tradition.
Boukman had called them to an area called Bwakaima. First on the agenda was strategy.
That ceremony of Wakaima is the first Haitian Congress, the beginning of the revolution.
C'est dans cette réunion où l'Africain décide de n'être plus esclave, d'être libre, déjà là dans la tête, de casser cette chaîne dans la tête, de dire voilà, à partir de cette cérémonie, on prend, l'Africain a pris son destin en main.
Haitian tradition says the slaves of Saint-Domingue planned that night to revolt. They timed their uprising to start on multiple plantations in 2 weeks' time. And they swore each other to secrecy.
They even said that they killed a pig and they drank the blood. This is what we call a communion. Communion that to keep what you have heard, what you have said to themselves.
The God of the white man calls him to commit crimes. Our God orders revenge. He will direct our hands. He will aid us.
On the night of August 22nd, 1791, 1,000 enslaved Africans attacked their masters.
Les esclaves empoisonnaient, les esclaves piquaient, les esclaves tuaient, les esclaves voulaient leur indépendance.
For them to be free, they have to have the same amount of violence that you exerted on them. That's why the revolution was very brutal. This is that hatred in the first day that came out.
The rebel numbers grew from 1,000 to 20,000 as newly liberated slaves burned cane fields and refineries in order to destroy the system that had enslaved them. Within 3 days, the most profitable plantations in the Americas had been laid waste, 184 sugar plantations and 1,000 coffee farms. Whites and mixed-race people fled to the capital city for mutual protection. From there, they watched firestorms on all horizons.
You've got a fiery cataclysm of enormous scale. I mean, the people on ships in the harbor supposedly could read their mail by the light of these fires that were, 10, 15, 20 miles away, to give you some faint idea of what this would have been like if you were there.
The eruption of violence put Toussaint Louverture in a difficult position. His own fortunes were tied to the plantation system, and he had straddled the white and black worlds for some 15 years.
Toussaint was no longer a slave. He didn't have the mentality of a slave. He was the owner of 2 or 3 plantations. He was not of the same class anymore. His interests were different from the interests of the masses.
But Toussaint's first reaction to the raging violence was based neither on money nor race. It was personal. He went back to the plantation where he had been born to protect his former owners.
It's true that Toussaint Louverture did return to the plantation in the early days of the insurrection and kind of maintained order there. And there's the question of why. Why would he do that? I think Toussaint was somebody who understood the value of humanity in many ways, right? And I think he probably had gained that precisely from being on the receiving end of slavery.
Back in the capital city, as Toussaint helped his former master flee the violence, Saint-Domingue's whites repelled assault after assault. They soon regrouped and launched their own offensive. The bloodletting continued day after day, week after soul-numbing week. French colonist Pamphile de Lacroix.
The country is filled with dead bodies which lie unburied. The Negroes have left the whites with stakes driven through them into the ground. And the white troops, who take no prisoners, leave Negroes dead upon the field.
3 months after the revolution started, the voodoo priest Boukman Doti was killed in battle. White soldiers decapitated him and burned his body in view of the rebel camp. In the words of one observer, the conflict in Saint-Domingue had become an exterminating war. In the autumn of 1791, Toussaint Louverture could no longer sit on the sidelines. Despite a wife and children, despite the chance even of losing his own freedom, Toussaint didn't hesitate long.
He left everything. He dropped everything, and he went to the mountain.
It was an act of extraordinary risk. The island's 500,000 slaves outnumbered whites by 12 to 1. But their ultimate prospects were poor. Few had experience in military strategy, and they had no unifying history or long-term vision.
The fact is, a lot of people didn't really know what freedom was supposed to look like. Nobody had really even theorized or imagined this before.
Toussaint, on the other hand, had a unique window on the world. He was schooled in African and European culture alike, and had read some of France's most radical thinkers.
Toussaint had certainly read a text by l'Abbé Raynal, which predicted that out of the colonial slave system with its, frightening imbalance of numbers and horrible suffering and all of that, there would emerge a leader, revolutionary leader. I believe Raynal referred to him as a black Spartacus. Toussaint is a literate person. There's no way he would have missed this.
As rebel leaders struggled to forge a disciplined fighting force, Toussaint's talents and intellect set him apart. Then, in December 1791, some 4 months after the rebellion began, Black enthusiasm began to crumble. The new French government in Paris sent more than 10,000 military reinforcements to help the colonists reestablish white rule. Supplies were scarce in the mountains, and winter brought famine to the rebel lines. Thousands began to surrender.
Toussaint Louverture was not somebody who liked violence, really. He was good at it if he had to do it, but he preferred to use negotiation, diplomacy, guile, trickery, anything but. And if that didn't work, he'd kill you, no problem. But he'd try anything else first.
Toussaint Louverture was asked to write up a settlement offer in exchange for the freedom of 200 slave leaders and better working conditions on the plantations. The proposal offered to send most of the rebels back to the plantation. It was a stark recognition of 18th century realities.
Sometimes it's easy to look back at this and suggest that they were willing to sell out their followers. While the terms, I think it's true, are troubling in some ways, they were also trying to seek some change. And I think the key here is that it was really difficult to imagine that you would actually eliminate slavery.
New French commissioners had just arrived from Paris to restore order. More liberal than the planters, they urged Saint-Domingue's whites to accept the rebels' offer, and they called slave leaders to the capital of Le Cap for negotiations. Trust was minimal. Some slave rebels wanted to kill their white prisoners, but Toussaint Louverture argued against it. He wanted the whites returned to Le Cap as a gesture of goodwill.
So Toussaint is sent to negotiate with the planters with the idea that, in a sense, a settlement can be reached. The settlement is not only for the freedom of some of the insurgent leaders, but also for some reforms on the plantation. Small reforms, but reforms that, at least in the letters they describe, their followers really want.
Whether the small group of leaders actually would have had the power to say to all of these people that they'd taken out, okay, you're going back to work now, here's your chains. I don't know. As it happened, the white people were so short-sighted that they didn't even give them the opportunity to try.
The whites said no. They said no. Because at that time, they were the one who wanted revenge. They forget about what they have done for 3 centuries, and they think that they were the victims in that thing. So they have to avenge themselves. So they're not going to forgive or forget anything. They refused.
Of course, he's taken up arms against them. But at the same time, he's made a lot of concessions, and he's struggled against his own followers to say, look, we're going to treat the prisoners well, we're going to trade with them, we're willing to make a deal. And to have that refused by the planter class, I think certainly must have had a radicalizing effect.
Toussaint's support for a settlement abruptly ended, and with it, the best deal the whites would ever see. Back in France, the Democratic Revolution had turned to terror. France's Revolutionary Army was at war with neighboring countries. Its radical leaders sought to purge themselves of enemies from within. They executed thousands. In an early 1793, they did the unthinkable. The revolutionary government beheaded the king.
Events in France were moving faster than anyone had ever intended. I mean, this was volcanic upheaval, a true class revolution that turned everything completely upside down. And each ripple that came out would strike the shores of Saint-Domingue.
One of the biggest ripples from France that washed into Saint-Domingue's shores was a commissioner named Léger Félicité Sonthonax. He was a French revolutionary with radical ideas about life in the colony.
Sonthonax arrives in Saint-Domingue having already had bad words said about him. There are people who've actually written from France to the colonists in Saint-Domingue saying, watch out for this guy. He's an abolitionist. He wants to abolish slavery.
Saint-Domingue's mixed-race population had so far retained its fragile alignment with the whites. To ensure that continued, Sonthonax created a representational council on the island and invited mixed-race citizens to serve. He even brought mixed-race men into the colonial government.
And a lot of white planters are really upset about that and see him as a really destructive force.
The white planters had cause for worry. Less than 2 years after joining the rebellion, Toussaint Louverture had risen to the top of the rebel army.
I am Toussaint Louverture. My name is perhaps known to you.
In 1793, he wrote an open letter to the island's disenfranchised.
I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint-Domingue. I work to bring them into existence. Unite yourselves to us, brothers, and fight with us for the same cause.
With his letter, he announces two things. He announces, first of all, his commitment to the process, to the project of emancipation. And he announces his presence as a leader, maybe even the leader. He has gained great respect from his followers. And with this proclamation, he's essentially saying, you want freedom, and I'm the one who's going to bring you that freedom. So I'm the person to follow in this regard.
But Toussaint at this time was addressing the wider world too. He was particularly focused on Spain.
The Spanish wanted to wrestle the colony away from France for two reasons. First, the colony was very prosperous in spite of the war. And second, that prosperity was used by the French Revolution to combat them in Europe.
Spain controlled Saint-Domingue's neighboring colony. So in June of 1793, Toussaint struck a deal. Spanish garrisons just over the border provided guns and ammunition to the slave army and tipped the balance their way. Toussaint's forces captured 3 cities within 8 months. Saint-Domingue's white planters were desperate. Many hated the new order in France. In a treasonous move, they invited the British to help put down the slave rebellion. Now, the empires of France, Spain, and England, along with a vast army of former slaves, were fighting for control of the small island colony. Then, in early 1794, events in Paris caused another explosion in the colony. A multiracial delegation from Saint-Domingue had appeared in France's National Assembly. They had been sent by Commissioner Sonthonax with a dramatic message. He had pledged freedom to Saint-Domingue slaves for fighting the armies of Britain and Spain. The emissaries made a compelling argument.
These are the principles and the ideals of France, and we fully represent them, and we wish to continue to represent them on our island. And so we've come to present our arguments about why we are, in fact, truly committed to those ideas and principles, and how we epitomize these principles of the French Revolution.
I think it was very powerful for the representatives of France to hear essentially that what had happened in the Caribbean is that the white slave owners had deserted France. They had gone over to the British, they had fought against the Republic. And the true people, the true Republicans in Saint-Domingue were these enslaved people who just wanted their freedom.
The French National Assembly endorsed the emancipation of Saint-Dominguean slaves. But that was not all. The delegates freed slaves throughout the entire empire, too.
And there's rejoicing and celebration. There's an older woman, a free woman of color, who's traditionally gone to the debates, who sort of sheds tears and is brought down and celebrated as part of this moment. And there are speeches in Paris, celebrations of this event throughout France. It's really seen as a kind of triumph for the French Revolution, for the ideals of the French Revolution, that this worst form of hierarchy, enslavement, and oppression has been abolished in the Caribbean.
It was utterly unprecedented. In a stroke, nearly 1 million black slaves had become French citizens. Word that the French revolutionary government had freed its slaves reached Saint-Domingue quickly. It was one of history's great watersheds, and due largely to the extraordinary military accomplishments of Toussaint's army. But the credit did not rest with Toussaint alone. He had several able commanders working under him, men like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who shared his soldiers' life experiences more closely than Toussaint.
Dessalines had been mistreated in slavery considerably, whipped a lot. He had tremendous whip scars on his back that he liked to display on occasion. He had deep reserves of anger and violence, but also a very intelligent man.
For Dessalines and Toussaint, emancipation changed everything. They quickly trimmed their sails to the new order.
Toussaint realized that Spain had a king, England had a king, and France was talking about liberty, equality, fraternity. All men equal. So he realized that although the revolt started by fighting the French right now could be the best help they could receive. So he rejoined the French.
After 3 years in opposition, Toussaint Louverture was once again a loyal French citizen. So were his followers. It tipped the balance. Before long, Toussaint, Dessalines, and the army of ex-slaves pushed the Spanish out of Saint-Domingue. The British soon followed. Word of Toussaint's astonishing string of victories against white armies was spreading across the European world.
They didn't like it. They didn't like it at all that there was a black general beating white armies. They didn't like it.
Slaveholders everywhere were stunned and worried.
In the United States, for instance, and in Cuba, they didn't want even white Frenchmen to come because they would tell the story. Why are you running away from Saint-Domingue? They would answer that. And no matter what they answer, it would be known that there was a black revolt.
We confronted dangers in order to gain our liberty, and we will be able to confront death in order to keep it. Slaves had once accepted their chain because they had not experienced a state happier than slavery. But those days are over. The people of Saint-Domingue would rather be buried in the ruin of their country than suffer the return of slavery.
Toussaint's ringing language showed his profound attachment to democratic ideals, but there was another side to Toussaint too.
Anybody who looked like they threatened Toussaint either ended up dead or deported.
Toussaint had already been appointed Brigadier General and then Governor of Saint-Domingue. No black man had ever risen so far in the colonies. But Toussaint had a rival. The beloved French civil commissioner, Félicité Sonthonax.
Sonthonax was extremely popular because he was the one to say, okay, slavery is abolished. He was very popular, and the blacks used to call him Papa Sonthonax. That didn't go well with Toussaint.
Toussaint is very friendly with Sonthonax as long as Sonthonax can serve his purposes. No, and nothing personal about it. When Sonthonax becomes useless, he will send him back over there. That's as simple as that.
And in 1797, Toussaint, in fact, no longer needed Sonthonax. In a series of political maneuvers, he isolated the civil commissioner. Then in August, he forced Sonthonax off the island. Toussaint Louverture had triumphed again. In 1798, as Toussaint Louverture was evicting the last of the British from his island, another French general battled British interest halfway around the world in Egypt. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte.
Well, Toussaint and Napoleon in many ways are similar. Both were a little bit from the margins of French society. They succeeded through military brilliance, and they're both incredible military leaders. And they became political leaders as a result of their military experience.
But Napoleon's victories would put Toussaint's at risk. Just months after conquering Egypt, Napoleon marched into Paris. A coup d'etat toppled the revolutionary government, and Napoleon took the reins of power. The revolution is over, he declared. I am the revolution.
As Napoleon is rising to power in France, Toussaint is watching closely about what's going on. He knows several things. He knows, first of all, that there are very powerful pro-slavery voices in France who are agitating against him, attacking him, and proposing that slavery actually be recreated in some form in Saint-Domingue.
Toussaint believed Saint-Domingue's survival and the survival of freedom itself depended on his ability to mobilize people to rebuild the devastated economy. And in Toussaint's mind, that meant one thing. His black followers should return to the cane fields.
There were some compelling reasons for this. I mean, mainly in Toussaint's situation, he was really in a bind at that point. In the sense that his hope for peace was restoring productivity on the plantations, recreating the sugar trade in particularly. But nobody wanted to go back to that kind of work, so he pretty well had to force them. And then the people began to think, this is a lot like slavery.
He was strong, maybe a little too strong with the blacks in several occasions, but he had to do it. He had to do it. To be a leader, you got to know where to lay back, and you have to know when to say, okay, guys, go ahead, let's do it. If you don't do it, hell, whatever the consequences, you'll pay for it.
Most newly freed slaves didn't see it that way. They wanted to work for themselves, growing crops for food rather than export. Toussaint's luster began to tarnish. Napoleon, on the other hand, was riding high. He restructured the government and proclaimed a new constitution for France. Far from enshrining black emancipation, it opened the door for France to reinstitute slavery in its colonies.
When Louverture heard that, he really understood that something was changing. And more ominously, he understood that he didn't have any way to influence Napoleon. And so what he did in kind of typical Toussaint fashion is he responded by saying, okay, Saint-Domingue is going to have its own laws. Well, here they are. I'm in charge here, I might as well write the Constitution.
Toussaint's constitution decreed slavery would never exist in Saint-Domingue again. and it was the first in history to prohibit discrimination based on skin color, a milestone that U.S. law would not guarantee for another 150 years. The Constitution had troubling elements too. It made Toussaint governor for life, with sole authority to designate his successor.
Toussaint is a great hero to me, but this was not a good idea. I mean, he basically, with that gesture, installed permanent military dictatorship, which has remained a problem in Haiti for 2 centuries. He could have done what he needed to do without that, I think. I'm not quite sure why he did it. But that was enough to send Napoleon over the edge.
Napoleon Bonaparte had had enough of revolution, and according to Napoleon, the U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, shared his view.
The prospect of a black republic is equally disturbing to the Spanish, the English, and the Americans. Jefferson has promised that at the instant the French army has arrived, all measures will be taken to starve Toussaint. Rid us of these gilded Negroes, and we will have nothing more to wish for.
Toussaint tried urgently to show Napoleon that military logic, if nothing else, proved the merit of black ambition.
Toussaint was writing Napoleon. He wanted so much to be recognized as saving this land for France.
His efforts failed. In 1802, Toussaint was stunned to see the largest French expeditionary force ever assembled entering Saint-Domingue's harbor. Its mission was simple. Napoleon wanted to turn back the clock.
My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint-Domingue is not so much based on consideration of commerce and money as on the need to block forever the march of the blacks in the world.
Toussaint Louverture fought the invading French army for 3 grueling months, but the island's black population, now disenchanted with his leadership, offered lackluster support. On May 6, 1802, Toussaint Louverture surrendered. At first, he was allowed to retire from the army with full honors. But a month later, he was called to a meeting with the French commander.
If I wanted to count all the services that I have rendered to the French government, I will need several volumes, and still I wouldn't finish it all.
Arrêtez-le. Toussaint was arrested on charges of conspiracy.
He wrote some stuff that's very eloquent, saying, I rather suspect that it's because of my color that you're treating me like a common criminal, although I prefer not to believe this.
And to compensate me for all the services, they arrested me arbitrarily in Saint-Domingue. They choked me and dragged me like a criminal without any decorum or concern for my rank. Is that the recompense due my work?
Normally, a mutinous French officer would have been brought before a military tribunal, so he comports himself as if he's going to have a military trial.
Toussaint's sons had been educated in France. They had even met Napoleon. Hoping again that Napoleon would understand his thinking, Toussaint peacefully boarded a ship for France. Saint-Domingue remained mostly calm in Toussaint's wake. Jean-Jacques Dessalines and the other black officers continued cooperating with French General Victor Leclerc. But then, news arrived from the nearby colony of Guadeloupe, Napoleon had reinstated slavery.
Leclerc reported that he had Dessalines in his pocket and controlled him and had mastered his spirit. Well, he was extremely wrong about that.
Saint-Domingue erupted in anger and fear. Dessalines quickly broke from France. One more time, the former slaves of Saint-Domingue took to the field against European armies.
Dessalines is a no-holds-barred, no-compromising leader and figure who is going to eradicate anything that stands in the way of what the people have been mobilizing towards.
That's generally reported that Dessalines killed all the white people, a massacre of all the white people, race war. No, not really. There's one report by a survivor who managed to get out to escape by masquerading as an American, because Dessalines was not killing Americans or English, just French.
One fleeing white, Pierre Chazot, paused on a mountaintop to observe the devastation.
No less than 10 square leagues of country burning like volcanoes. The rapidity of the conflagration was such as to make the beholder believe that large and thick trains of gunpowder had previously been laid down.
The war becomes this extreme scorched earth kind of campaign in which Dessalines and others burn the towns in order to basically leave the French with no choice but to depart.
Dessalines' scorched earth tactics worked. In 1803, the French army was finally driven out. 50,000 French soldiers had died. And Saint-Domingue, Haiti, became the world's first Black Republic.
This is a powerful story. It wasn't just an anti-colonial revolution, but it was also an anti-slavery revolution in that it said your economy and your privilege, which is based on forced labor, cannot stand, it will not stand. It's a message that translates through time.
Independence is the strongest feeling of human being.
I think we all, in some ways, have inherited something from this revolution, because it's really the first place that people insisted absolutely that human rights were for all people.
It's something that everybody should know about it, to know exactly what our species, not black people, but our species can realize.
But Toussaint Louverture never lived to see victory. By the time Haiti attained the goal he fought so hard to achieve, the imprisoned revolutionary had died in a freezing cell in the mountains of France. "And overthrowing me," Louverture wrote as he left for France, "you have only cut down the trunk of the liberty tree of the blacks in Saint-Domingue. It will spring back from the roots, for they are numerous and deep."
Égalité for All, Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution is available on DVD. The companion book is also available. To order, visit shoppbs.org or call us at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
500 years ago, Europeans and Africans met for the first time on these shores. The encounter created the slave trade and changed the world. The slave trade remains a missing chapter in our history. Yet Britain led the world in the exploitation of human cargo. This story is not just one of slave raiding by Europeans, but slave trading by Africans. Greed led African kings to sell 12 million people across the ocean. This is not a tale of a trade which grew by accident, but one of a global business created by royal appointment.
The Royal African Company is to be incorporated to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling and bartering of gold, silver, Negroes, slaves.
Nor is it simply the story of passive, suffering Negroes freed by heroic white crusaders, but one of black uprising. And above all, this is not a tale of a dead past. It still shapes the way Britons live today.
William Beckford and his father, Alderman Beckford, to put it bluntly, owned my ancestors.
It brings some Britons face to face with a heritage they've never before confronted.
My grandfather was what I'd consider probably a very charming man, and in his young days he was quite a dish. Actually, he really was.
And for the first time, Britons, black and white, discover a common ancestry. It's an ancestry rooted in a past when British ships carried African slaves. Bristol. This sleepy port was once a mercantile powerhouse which dominated the transatlantic slave trade. Ships that wrenched millions of Africans from their homes crowded the Avon for a century. Yet a visitor today sees a city stripped of any reminder of that cargo. Bristol has turned its back on the trade that made it rich.
I was simply amazed by the fact that there was no recognition that Bristol's wealth lay in the Atlantic trade. In vain, I went to the museum, for example, to see whether there was a display there. Not a word of it. I looked at my university and saw whether anyone was teaching it. Not a bit of it. I talked to people in the street, and they were completely ignorant of it. And I think that really in the 20th century, Bristol went through a long period of denial that there really was, as it were, a participation in this wider world.
The city's authorities have long resisted efforts, especially by the black communities, to mark its slave trading past.
There has been a genuine fear in Bristol of what the consequences would be if the truth were known. And part of the fear was generated, I think, was because the people who had the control over whether that history came out or not actually didn't know themselves what the extent and the nature of Bristol's involvement was. And I think it's more fear than denial.
But in early March this year, the first sign of change appeared. Bristol's dignitaries gathered for the opening of a new footbridge. It was a small step, but a victory for the campaign to commemorate one of the slaves who lived in Bristol, a man called Perot Jones.
We are here with our friends to show our respect to our ancestors who lived and died in this city as enslaved Africans. It's often not known that in 1725, Bristol alone enslaved 16,550 Africans in that 1 year.
It's a bridge that helps us come to terms with, to understand, and sometimes to confront a shared past. a past that contains, for many of us, great sadness.
This moment is a sign that Britain is waking up to its slave trading history. Pharaoh Jones belonged to a Bristol family, the Pinneys. Britain's slave past does not start with Africa. It begins in 17th century England with the British Empire's first slaves, white men. The founder of the Pinney dynasty, Azariah, was farming in Dorset when he was swept up in a rebellion against the king.
The Duke of Monmouth landed in Lyme Regis in June 1685, and Azariah, probably tired of haymaking, saw these redcoats crossing the end of the field and thought that looked rather more fun than haymaking, and why don't I go and join them? And off he went. And in July of 1685, he fought the disastrous Battle of Sedgemoor. The Duke of Monmouth was executed, and a very large number of others were executed too. Some were transported, and Azariah, my ancestor, was one of those lucky ones, being sent to the island of Nevis as an indented servant, which meant he was more or less a slave himself.
When Azariah Pinney landed, the island of Nevis was little more than untamed bush. The English convicts were put to work alongside native Indians and a few imported Africans. They cleared the island, first for tobacco, then for a new luxury crop, sugar.
At that time, the West Indies was something like a gold rush. There was this new chance to make quite a lot of money quite quickly, and a lot of people came out from this country to do it. And in fact, they employed Negroes imported from Africa as slaves, and they employed, after the Battle of Sedgemoor, quite a large number of white people who were indented servants like Azariah.
Azariah persuaded his sister to buy him out of servitude. Within a year, she had set him up in the sugar business. He quickly saw that convicts and Indians could not survive the harsh conditions, but his own time in the fields had shown him where the answer lay: Africa.
Large numbers of Negroes were shipped from Africa to the West Indies, and the African or the Negro population increased, and the white population decreased.
Within 2 generations, his heir, John Pinney, was meticulously recording the purchase of African slaves for his booming plantations, including one he named Pharaoh Jones.
I desire you to take the earliest opportunity of buying me 10 new Negroes. Never let them be younger than 10 years, and never let them be as old as 30 if you can help it. Get them at St. Kitts or any other islands where they may be had best and cheapest.
His grandfather's enslavement probably made John Pinney uneasy about owning slaves, but the scriptures stilled his conscience.
I can assure you I was shocked at the first appearance of human flesh
exposed to sale. But surely God ordained them for the use and benefit of us. Otherwise his divine will would have been made manifest by some particular sign or token.
He was motivated by commerce, but in doing so, it seems that he regarded his slaves as his principal asset, and he looked after his asset. I flatter myself to say a word respecting the care of my slaves and stock. Your own good sense must tell you they are the sinews of a plantation, and must claim your particular care and attention.
Humanity tempered with justice towards the former must ever be exercised. They surely deserve it, being the very means of our support.
They should be kept clean of ticks.
The demand for the Pinnish sugar was huge. To meet the demand, they needed more slaves, but they had to raise cash to buy those slaves. They turned to the merchants in the City of London for help. The money men were prepared to give loans to planters, but it was the higher profits from the slave ships that offered the best returns. The city wanted that business all to itself. The king was always ready to trade favours for cash. He granted a royal charter which gave a single London company, the Royal African Company, exclusive rights over the slave trade. In return, the royal family became its biggest shareholders.
Charles II, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland. To all to whom these presents shall come, greeting. Whereas Guinea, Benin, Angola, and South Barbary, and the sole and only trade and traffic thereof, are the undoubted right of our heirs and successors, and whereas the trade of said regions is of great advantage to subjects of this kingdom, the Royal African Company is to be incorporated in the name of our dearest brother, James, Duke of York, His Highness Prince Rupert, Anthony, Earl of Shaftesbury, Henry, Earl of Arlington, His Grace the Duke of Buckingham, John, Earl of Bath. We hereby grant unto the same Royal African Company of England to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling, and bartering of gold, silver, negroes, slaves, goods, ware, and manufactures.
The company's men would let nothing stand in the way of their drive for profits. They already knew that slavery was widely practiced in West Africa. In most African nations, it was an alternative to a prison system.
Those who committed crimes, convicts, could be sold into slavery. If you owed a debt, you could be sold into slavery. Sometimes through deceit, or you could be tricked into slavery.
Slaves were also acquired as captives of Africa's wars. Europeans had long been part of an established system for bartering them.
The first Europeans who came to Ghana were the Portuguese, and they arrived in 1471. And when they got here, they found that there was a brisk trade in slaves between Ghana and its West African neighbors. And for 100 years, Portugal remained on the coast of Ghana and took part in this coastal trade, going to Senegal, bringing goods from Senegal, from Nigeria to Ghana, and bringing slaves in exchange for gold. And this was a situation before the transatlantic slave trade was introduced.
The Royal African Company had no interest in the coastal trade. They wanted slaves to ship across the Atlantic. They found a ready supply in local prisoners of war.
When you went to war and you defeated the people, you took captives home. So you decided what to do with the captives. How many slaves do we need for farming? How many do we need for the army? How many do we need for domestic work, etc., etc.? After they've gone through all those logistics, the excess goes through the Atlantic slave trade.
The image we have today of the slave trade as mass kidnapped by Europeans couldn't be further from the truth. For both sides, this was just business.
The African role in the transatlantic slave trade must not be swept under the carpet. The greed factor was there. Kingdoms made money. They rose as a result of the trade. Big, powerful people, rich families were created as a result of the Africans who were active collaborators in the trade.
The company found that African kings were just as greedy as England's own royal family. They were willing to supply exactly what the plantations needed.
The slave owners in the West Indies, they preferred slaves from the Gold Coast, because they said these were very hard-working, hardy slaves.
Local businesses sprang up to supply the transatlantic market. The European traders had no need to round up the slaves.
The Europeans themselves did not go inland to the villages or to the town to capture slaves. They remained at the forts and the castles. And it was the African traders who sold the slaves to the Europeans. Now, what happened was that There were middlemen who would meet the inland traders bringing the slaves. They would buy these slaves and then in turn resold them to the European merchants in the castles.
Rival European powers were building castles to protect their cargoes. Within a century, there would be a fort every 3 miles on what used to be called the Gold Coast. It came to be known as the Slave Coast. The Royal African Company appealed to its major shareholder, James II. He began a string of garrisons, motivated possibly by the national interest, but more likely by his own profits. Every time a British ship was sighted, its sailors could rely on a welcome from the fort and from the African settlement next to it.
We took up our old anchorage opposite Cape Coast Castle and made arrangements for commencing our old business of gathering a cargo. Our first object is to lay in stocks of rice for the slaves on the passage to the West Indies. You will naturally think it must be difficult to transact business with these people from ignorance of their language. But they have been for so many years trading with the English that all the traders have broken English enough for the purpose.
The transatlantic slave trade dominated West Africa. For some kingdoms, selling slaves became an economic necessity. And all along the coast, new trading settlements were springing up.
In the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade became the most important activity on the coast. We find that almost every town, coastal town, and almost every European fort and castle was involved in slave trading. So we have about 65 slave markets in Ghana alone.
The Africans could hardly have anticipated the consequences of all this, but the bargain they struck with the European slave traders transformed the continent. What started as a local tradition turned into a monster that eventually swallowed 12 million people.
Slavery existed in societies that had no prison systems. It was part of the punitive measures against criminal conduct, criminal behavior. The slaves lost their liberty. They went away, maybe into the neighboring state or the neighboring nation, but only for a season. It was not a long-term loss of liberty. And the children of the slaves, of course, were never slaves in that context. But here, of course, with the transatlantic slave trade, you have a final separation. People went away and they never came back.
Slavery would spirit millions away from the continent. It would be the cause of war and torment. And it would drag both Africa and Europe to a harsh new era. By the 18th century, the coastal towns of West Africa were making vast profits. But the price paid by Africans was enormous. The slaves were suffering treatment they had never endured before.
In the indigenous system, especially in Ghana, no slave owner had the power of life and death over the slave. But in the castle, you could do anything to the slave. You could kill the slave, you could maim the slave, you could mutilate the slave, you could punish the slave as you liked.
Cape Coast Castle in modern Ghana, the headquarters of the Royal African Company, a place of misery and terror.
They lived in the dungeons as though they were animals, you know, so they weren't given enough food to eat. They were prisoners. We have the condemned cell where turbulent slaves were kept, and a lot of them were turbulent because, I mean, if you live in your country and somebody comes out here and takes you into captivity, you wouldn't take kindly to that.
Slaves were packed into every space. They could be trapped here for months. There were only two ways out, to the sea and the slave ships, or to the graveyard.
They had to go to the bathroom in the dungeons, they were fed in the dungeons. Their whole life was in the dungeons, and that was very uncomfortable, very unhealthy. There could be some epidemics, no windows. They really were confined to those little rooms.
The forts became a byword for cruelty and rape. The Europeans' moral restraint evaporated under the African sun.
Most of the colonial officials who came onto the coast came without their wives. So most of them became mistresses. They doubled up as domestic servants, as mistresses, concubines for these officials. For some of the female slaves who lived in the dungeons, the governor saw, in inverted commas, some of the female slaves. And when they were found pregnant, if they were lucky, they were set free.
The Europeans had no shame about declaring their conquests. In Cape Coast, families still carry names like Gonzalez, Coleman, Frith, and Da Silva.
You had the European merchants intermarrying or having local African women, and their offspring, called the mulattoes, also growing in number. As the slaves were brought in, not everybody was sold and shipped off. Some remained. And so one would see a kind of a cosmopolitan life growing along the coast.
The West Africans tolerated the traders' brutality because European military backing gave them power, and they needed to import cheap brass and iron tools for farming and cooking. The Africans were always hunting for a better deal. It was the small English town of Bristol which offered that deal. Local mineral deposits gave the city a unique advantage. Bristol could make high-grade metal goods cheaply. Factories spread across the Avon Valley to meet the new African demand.
This is what's known as a guinea pan that was used as one of the trade items that filled the Bristol merchant ships that sailed to West Africa. And for several of these, one could exchange a slave in the early part of the 18th century. And it was because these small factories on the Avon Valley were able to develop an industrial structure to manufacture these in large quantities cheaply that basically Bristol was able to develop a slave trade in the early 18th century.
Bristol's golden age was dawning. The families who transformed the city used their wealth to buy huge estates. Abraham Elton's descendants still live in his stately home, Clevedon Court.
Well, he was very much a self-made man. He came from a rather humble background. He was apprenticed to a mariner and became a master mariner, but clearly had a strong entrepreneurial flair, and finally became a merchant.
Abraham spotted the opportunities in metals. He bought land bearing extensive deposits of copper and began to search for new markets.
He was looking for an outlet for his copper products. He had the raw materials for the business, he had the copper works, he had an outlet with the Bristol brass industry for the copper, but naturally he was looking for wider markets.
Abraham's seafaring connections told him that Africans would pay good money for high-grade brass. He seized the opportunity.
A wide number of people were involved in stocking the slave ships. So something that seems completely unconnected to the slave trade, such as the brass industry, was actually very much geared to an export market to the West African coast, because West African warlords wanted brass pots. And so most of the brass pots were directed for what they called the Guinea trade.
Abraham was an aggressive cost cutter. He and others spotted that with a simple redesign, the ships that took their metal goods to Africa could also carry slaves to the Caribbean. They could then bring back sugar to England. At a stroke, their costs were slashed and their profits doubled. Their insight gave birth to the triangular trade.
What you tried to do was to fill your ships on the outward journey to Africa. You would then be paid for the slaves you took on the next leg of the journey, and then the third leg bringing the sugar and the tobacco back and the rum back to Bristol, which you then sold on, so that you minimised as far as you could your financial risks.
The Bristol merchants had succeeded in surpassing the Royal African Company. They gave the African customers what they wanted at half the price.
It was not an exchange of unequals, it was an exchange of equals. One must remember that many of these African societies, some of the cities were very large, and therefore they were not going to have shoddy European goods. So it required great skill in getting the right sorts of commodities, and the Bristol merchants in particular were very skilled at bringing together these different items which were acceptable for trade.
The breakthrough in Bristol sent slave trade profits soaring. The city's restless merchants would use those profits to begin an historic shift in British life, the Industrial Revolution. Among Abraham Elton's circle of friends was Thomas Goldney, who had made a fortune from a single successful voyage. He ploughed some of the money into the work of an old family friend, Abraham Darby. Darby was experimenting with new ways of making high-grade iron goods. He moved his works to Shropshire, where he started to smelt iron with coke, a revolutionary process. The iron produced in Coalbrookdale was tough enough to make tools that would not bend or break. It opened the way to the modern age.
These experiments took place in 1709, and they're generally considered to be the point, the defining moment at which the Industrial Revolution begins. What developed was a remarkable partnership between the people who had the know-how on the one hand and the people who had the money on the other. What the Shropshire ironmasters were trying to do was to find a source of coke-fired bar iron that was acceptable to the African market. And it was this, to some extent, that inspired the industrial developments that took place.
The Goldney-Darby partnership also inspired Ironbridge, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. This great leap forward is usually attributed to the native genius of British engineers, but it owed much to the demands of the African trade. By 1700, ships were pouring down the Severn Valley to Bristol, carrying goods destined for buyers on the West African coast.
To get a voyage to work, the merchants had to gather in commodities from the Bristol region. Many of these came from the Severn Valley, and it was the ability to get those commodities together that actually allowed the ships to trade with Africa and for the whole economies to work. So in some ways, the Industrial Revolution allowed the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, to be economically viable, to actually happen. Because without the Industrial Revolution, the commodities would have been too expensive and the African communities would not have been willing to trade.
In Africa, Bristol's iron was so valuable, it became a kind of currency.
Trade is all done on the principle of exchanging one piece of goods for another. All kinds of goods are priced by the number of bars of iron they're worth. Say 4 muskets equal to 40 bars, tobacco, beads and cloth, 20 bars. The total is more or less according to the value of the slave, so that supposing the bar is worth 1 shilling and 6pence, these goods would purchase a slave worth about £9 sterling, which at present is about the price of a prime slave.
The sugar trade with Bristol had made Nevis rich, but it was a tedious backwater. John Pinney, now a successful sugar planter, longed to come home to Bristol.
The magic of the gold rush was over. A lot of people were coming back to this country and trying to bring money they'd made in Nevis or in other West Indies back to this country, and he was one of those too.
Pinney had built a great house, Mount Travis, on the island of Nevis, and acquired 13 sugar estates. His grandfather had been a convict. He was returning to Bristol the equivalent of a millionaire. But he didn't leave it all behind. As he sailed away from Nevis, he brought with him the ultimate status symbol of the prosperous West Indian planter, a slave he had named Pero Jones. Pero was separated from the last of his African family, his sisters Nancy and Shaba, when he set off for England, never to return. Pinney and Pero moved into a brand new house in Bristol.
He built the house that we're now sitting in. He acquired land in Somerset. He still had land and houses in Dorset. He continued in the sugar business, trading with the plantations in the West Indies, at a time when sugar was becoming increasingly part of the diet.
England probably seemed strange to Pero the African, but the sight of a black man was far from unusual in Bristol. Many merchants kept slaves as valets and housekeepers.
He may have started as a slave, but he is described as a servant or valet. And he looked after John Pinney personally. One imagined bringing his shaving water, setting out his clothes and so on. He was working for John Pinney for 32 years.
On John Pinney's return to Bristol, he found a city more interested in spending money than in making it. Complacency would cost Bristol dear. In 1794, the Bristol poet Romain Thorne wrote an epic poem in praise of the city. It somehow neglected to mention the slave trade.
Majestic Bristol, to thy happy port prolific commerce makes its loved resort. Thy gallant ships with spacious sails unfurled waft to thy shore the treasures of the world.
The docklands were the heartland of Bristol, and you had lovely residential houses being built just across the street from the warehouses by merchants who were all growing very grand by the 1720s and 30s from what was a pretty money-grubbing and hands-dirtying trade. And then if you walk across to Queen Square, there were at least 8 African merchants in this square that was developed in the 1720s. It was one of the first provincial examples of what people have called the urban renaissance, you know, the beautiful Georgian explosion of houses and facilities in the urban center. And it was very much financed and driven by people directly involved in the slave trade. And the whole square was really peopled by those, not only in the Africa trade, but in the West India, Carolina, and Virginia trades. They were all in it. And these were the same people who, while they're shipping slaves from Angola to St. Kitts in decks no higher than 4 foot 2 inches. They're also investing in the Theatre Royal. They're becoming patrons in banks. They're investing in the new private libraries. So you have this strange mixture of brutality and gentility that is just very much part and parcel of this triangular trade.
In Bristol, wealth bought respectability. The men who had made their fortunes from the slave business craved social recognition.
To be a trader or a merchant in the 18th century was still to have low status. You were still shown the back entrance, as it were. So that when you came into vast sums of money, which is what the slave merchants and the traders in slave-produced commodities acquired, you had to buy yourself into society. Now, the way to do that was simple. You had to build a mansion, a pile, hopefully in the neoclassical, Neo-Palladian style, to show that you had learning or that you understood the classics. And then you had to patronize art.
Thomas Goldney was now one of Bristol's commercial aristocrats. He created an estate in the newly fashionable district of Clifton. The elegant veneer concealed the hard-nosed businessman.
In this garden is where essentially all Goldney's interests can be linked symbolically. Out here we have the harbour, where he could see the ships coming in, the slave ships going out, his commodities, his industrial goods coming down from Shropshire. He then laid out some wonderful gardens, including over here a tower, which is in fact an engine house, which contained a steam engine, the type that was used to pump mines, which his investments up in Shropshire, the Cobledale Company, were producing. But he used it not to pump mines, but to pump his own water gardens, to recycle water backwards and forwards.
The splendour of the Goldney estate had one main purpose: to impress Bristol's social elite. Beneath the garden, he built a grotto full of rare finds from his ventures in the South Seas and the West Indies. They thrilled his guests. Thomas Goldney, the grocer's son, was now a global player. The new rich of Bristol could leave the past behind very quickly. Goldney's friend, Abraham Elton, was now Sir Abraham.
His standing in Bristol was immense. He became mayor in 1710 and had his portrait painted wearing the scarlet robes. He became MP for Bristol, and he was so wealthy that he contributed £10,000 to the rather depleted coffers of George I, and as is usual with these things, he was, of course, made a baronet.
By the time he died, Sir Abraham hoped the family had buried its links to the slave business.
He'd amassed a fortune by his death of £100,000 in their money. He was somebody like Richard Branson. He made a huge amount of money through his own entrepreneurial skills. I think anybody that comes from nothing and makes that kind of a fortune on their own skill, then as now, is extraordinary, is admirable in lots of ways. They weren't plantation owners, they weren't slavers. They were primarily concerned to export their goods to the widest possible market. And it seems to me with the Elton family, at any rate, the slaving part was just part of the cycle of trade.
For the next 100 years, good works became a passion with the Eltons.
The Elton that really got going with the development of Clevedon was the Reverend Sir Abraham, who was the 5th baronet. He put in the main drainage, the sewage, the gas works, he built the hospital. He was immensely concerned with the health of the town and, of course, of his estate workers. He built the churches, the schools. I'm very proud of that.
The foundations of this family's wealth are now obscured by 100 years of philanthropy, and across Bristol the slave trade is virtually forgotten. In 1798, Perrault, the slave John Pinney had brought from Nevis, was dying.
All my family are well, except my servant, Perrault, who is very ill and now at Ashton for a change of air. I much doubt his recovery. One or other of us visit him 3 or 4 times a week. He has waited upon my person upwards of 32 years.
And I cannot help feeling much for him. Notwithstanding, he has not lately conducted himself as well as I could have wished. Pinney sent him to Long Ashton, just outside Bristol, where he convalesced, but then sadly died. And there is rather a charming, almost an obituary, saying how much he had come to know and to like him. Then there's the sting in the tail, even though at the end of his days he died of drunkenness. But still, he starts off by speaking well of this servant.
Perrault did not psychologically survive once removed outside of his own black community. And basically, once he came to Bristol, he drunk himself to death.
Perrault, I am sorry to inform you, died a few months ago, after being almost useless, caused by drunkenness and dissipation. Almost ever since we left Nevis in 1794, his conduct has been very reprehensible, insomuch that his mistress and every branch of my family have urged me to discharge him and send him back to Nevis with an annual allowance.
Perrault never made it back to his family in Nevis. The only records of his life are John Pinney's letters. But 200 years later, his name is commemorated by a bridge, a symbolic link between Bristol today and its slaving past.
And we reflect on the life of Perrault, the man after whom this bridge is named. Perrault, a black man, brought to a strange land in circumstances of servitude. So it gives me great pleasure to name this bridge Perrault's Bridge, to honor his memory, his name, and the struggle that he represented. Thank you.
By the time of Perrault's death, Bristol's gentlemanly traders had been ruthlessly pushed aside. There was a new pretender to the crown of England's leading slave port.
Well, Bristol's heyday in the slave trade, per se, was in the early 18th century, from 1698 till the 1740s, really. And then because she hadn't innovated the port to accommodate the larger ships, because there was a traditionalism about Bristol society, mercantile society, that was not as entrepreneurial, didn't seize the opportunities, as well as newer ports like Liverpool. We find that Liverpool eclipsed her by the mid-18th century and became much more important.
Location had made Bristol the master of the African trade. Location also proved the reason for its downfall. The Avon's retreating tide would regularly leave ships grounded on the mud. But the slave trade was expanding and needed bigger ships. Ambitious captains started to look for ports less awkward than Bristol.
It was a very difficult harbour to develop. And so really, effectively, Bristol was squeezed out of the trade by the bigger, more profitable ships from Liverpool, rather than the rather smaller scale activity that Bristol merchants developed in the 18th century.
Bristol's dominance of the trade with Africa had come to an end. Its merchants had made fortunes and now moved on to other ventures. But their partners in West Africa had no such alternatives. The Africans were trapped in the business of selling people. A ship's captain could buy 100 slaves at a time in the Salaga market, and the demand from the plantations would not let up. African suppliers reached further inland. Raiding parties were now spiriting away thousands of slaves.
People intentionally raided and kidnapped people into slavery. It was not like that before the Atlantic slave trade was introduced, because you had enough for the indigenous system, you know, so why should I kidnap?
the traders hit upon a new strategy. Wars between African nations always meant captives for sale, so the slavers supplied arms to some nations and encouraged their kings to wage war on vulnerable neighbors.
When there was peace, it means there were no captives to be sold as slaves, and therefore the slave trade would tend to decline at that particular moment. And then when there were wars, then of course the captives would be brought, and then the slave trade would be flourishing. So in a way, or to a large extent, the slave trade depended, I think, heavily on the conflicts between the local African peoples.
The slave traders had started an arms race in Africa. They never gave any African nation enough weaponry to challenge European power, but the guns served to keep Africans fighting each other for a century. The years of conflict and depopulation left a legacy from which Africa has still not recovered.
Many people are saying, why talk about the slave trade? We want to forget about it. It was such a terrible crime against humanity. Millions of people were sent. Again, we can't tell the number. We could talk about the number game in history. Some say 10 million, some say 12, some say 20 million. Some even say 300 million Africans were sent away. And Africa was depopulated. And all these things happened. We are putting up with it right now.
The slave trade left an indelible mark on this part of Africa.
When I compare it with the Nazis, I think the world perhaps has not given sufficient attention to the fact that Africans had suffered a Holocaust before the Jews did.
What it does to me is just a sense of outrage, of just limitless anger. I think that our underdevelopment can be traced to this period, because by 1400, people who have also used iron and domesticated animals and started cereal development, rice and corn and such things, we had no time to advance upon these. If you use the words of the most revered explorer, David Livingstone, commerce, civilization, and Christianity, the 3 C's. The first one we understand, trade. The slave trade itself was a commercial enterprise. I mean, the very forts that you will see on our coastline were not holiday resorts. They were holding pens for human beings. Then you talk of civilization. What kind of civilization were you talking about? Africa had civilizations. But because of the transatlantic slave trade, that civilization almost came to an abrupt end.
Africa was destined for a future of poverty and conflict. England's royal venture had reinvented the trade in human beings. And Caribbean planters were refining a brutal new system, plantation slavery.
We have one word for the underground spiritual game. Everybody, you say ayakata. Everybody, ayakata. And now you see, you are talking like white man. White man, when you talk small. Speak. No, man. African, we talk with black man, talk with all our mouths, man. Everybody, ayakata. Ayakata. Okay, let's go now. Official, ayakata. Official, 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 ayakutu, ayakete, ayakutu, ayakata, official, official. Hey, pass. Easy, 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 easy. Oh, it don't say pass, man. Oh, pass. Get in the music. Yeah, shit. Them go hold me to you, them go start to dab human beings. Animal talk, don't start again. Dash them human rights. Them go hold me to you, them go start yab human beings. Animal talk, don't start again. Dash them human rights. How animal go know say they no born me a slave? How animal go know say slave train don't pass? And they want dash us human rights. Animal must talk to human beings. Give them human rights. I beg you, make you hear me very well. I beg you, make you hear me very well. Human rights, now my property. So therefore, you can't dash me my property. Human rights, now my property. They want dash us human rights. Some people say, why are they talk like this? No be talk like this, them take to carry me, go prison, yo. No be me they talk, now Prime Minister Buffer they talk to you. No be me they talk, now Prime Minister Buffer they talk to you. Him said, the surprising will bring out the beast in us. Him said, the surprising will bring out the beast in us. Him say, the surprising will bring out the beast in us. Now hear my argument. Both are now friend to Tasha and Reagan. Both are now friend to some other leaders too. And together they want dash us human rights. Animal want dash us human rights. Animal can't dash me human rights. Both are now friend to Thatcher and Reagan. Both are now friend to some other leaders too. And together they want dash us human rights. Animal want dash us human rights. Animal can't dash me human rights. Animal want dash us human rights.
long. Hey, we've been sitting down for so long. We've been fooling around for too long. We've been sitting down for so long. And I've been fooling around for too long. So long, so long, for too long, too long, so long, so long, too long, too long. Hey. Oh Lord, can you hear me now? Remember, long time ago, when we used to live like prince and princess. Remember the pyramid of Egypt, when we used to live like prince and princess. Remember, Marcus Garvey, who are the dream for New Africa. Remember, Martin Luther King, who are the dream for New America. They say you are black, they say you are brown, they say them white, they say you are brown. But only the angels of God is white now. Only the angels of God is white. So long, too long, so long, it's too long. Say, we've been sitting down for so long. We've been fooling around for too long. Remember Marcus Garvey, who are the dream for New Africa. Remember Martin Luther King, who are the dream for New America. Remember King Selassie, who was betrayed by his people. Remember Lord Jesus Christ, who died for you and I to gain salvation. They say you are black, they say you are brown, but only the angels of God is white.